Okay, I'm recording. Right, hello YouTube. So today I'm going to be talking about metaethics with Lance Bush. He is completing a PhD on psychology of metaethics. Is that right? I don't know how it would be.
Well, it's the degree is in social psychology. My dissertation research is in the psychology of metaethics.
Right. Okay. Yes, you're one of the few people I've met who's even more firmly anti-realist, I think, than I am. So that was one reason why this conversation might be interesting. Yeah, we're going to talk about metaethics. I guess that's the introduction. I think that one place we can start is there's a sort of standard line that moral realists will take, where they will claim that realism has some sort of presumption in its favour, or realism is perhaps like the default position, in virtue of the fact that realism is, they think, just common sense. You know, that most people are just common sense realists. So and then I guess there's also an assumption that there's some philosophical value, or it's important that we capture or accommodate common sense in our philosophical theories. I mean, I guess that's a whole other thing to talk about. But even if you accept that, I mean, realists very often work with this assumption that realism is common sense. And I think that's something that we should get into, because it turns out that the evidence on this is pretty weak. Right.
Right. So there's this distinction that Michael Gill draws in his work on this topic, where he talks about this descriptive metaethics, and this is this thing that he says was a really central project of much of metaethics in the 20th century, was to capture the meaning of ordinary moral judgments, like what people mean and what they think when they make moral claims. There's lots of ways of unpacking that, because you could have this sort of you could ask the question, what sort of explicit theory, if any, ordinary people endorse? And you can ask a second question, which is, if you just look at the language itself, what's the best sort of explanation of what that language appears to be committed to, whether or not the speakers are explicitly aware of that? And you get this impression. You could find, we could just trot out quotes all day from philosophers, both realists and anti-realists, saying, yeah, it sure looks on the face of it like people are speaking and thinking like moral realists. And this has been used to sometimes to shift the burden of proof onto the anti-realists, or to argue that anti-realism is in some way revisionary, or to give some sort of dialectical advantage to moral realism. And the problem is that almost all of that was based on sort of armchair reasoning about what people mean when they make moral claims. Now, there's a lot of stuff you could do from the armchair. I am not at all faulting for philosophers for trying to think things through without engaging in empirical inquiry. It's not the only thing you could do. The problem is they are quite literally making claims about what ordinary people think and mean. That is an empirical claim. It's a claim about linguistics. It's a claim about psychology. And the method that they used for pursuing this, and this is something we can talk about, is not, I don't consider it sufficient on its own. It seems like there are like, you could actually conduct psychological research on that question. And this has only really begun in earnest very recently, in the past 20 years or so.
So, I mean, the method that I take that they've generally used is presenting cases that produce intuitions among other philosophers, usually. And I guess just looking at I suppose there's two methods, right? They will look at the surface form of moral statements, and they'll appeal to intuitions. What was the name of this paper you sent me? It was by Thomas Polzer and Jennifer Wright, I think.
They have a bunch of papers. Okay, it might have been the anti-realist pluralism paper.
Yes, that was it. I should have brought this up before starting to record this, because one of the things I was actually really struck by that, even though I am already sympathetic to the claim that people are less realist than philosophers often claim they are. One of the reasons why I always found it a bit odd that realists really push this claim that realism is the default position is that I so often hear those same realists complain about the naive relativism of undergraduate students. And I mean, that's true, right? That's something that I've certainly encountered. I've encountered plenty of that just like naive relativism. And they'll complain about that on the one hand, but then on the other say that realism is common sense. And so, I don't know, it seems like there's some sort of tension there. But even when I read this paper, it was quite striking. And obviously that's only one study, there's lots more to be done. But they presented laypersons with a whole bunch of different cases. And it turns out that I think they said that nobody gave consistently realist responses. Whereas there were a whole load of, I think it was something like half of the participants gave consistently anti-realist responses. And I mean, most of these questions were directly asking people what their metaethical commitments were. So, they'd sort of give a brief description of, different metaethical theories and ask which ones people endorsed. Or they would ask people to draw comparisons. So they'd say things like, is morality, are moral judgments more like, these judgments or more like these judgments? And yeah, it turns out, at least based on that paper, there's a hell of a lot of anti-realists out there.
So there's a couple things you could say in defense of the moral realist, saying, hey, the default position is realism, and it's really frustrating we have all these relativist students. The first is that there's a question of representativeness. So it might be that students in college are unusually likely to endorse relativism in contrast to the rest of the world's population. It could be that older people don't tend to be moral relativists, that children don't tend to be moral relativists, and that people outside of college classrooms, often at sort of elite universities where publications from those universities and those authors are most likely to get noticed, that those students in particular are idiosyncratic and everyone else tends to be a realist. And I actually find that at least somewhat plausible because the demographic and social characteristics of college students at elite universities really may incline them more towards relativism than you would expect of someone from, a religious community. Like, are we going to expect that Amish people are going to think about morality in the same way that college students are? I doubt it. Are we going to think that people in India are going to think the same way as people in the United States, or people in indigenous communities in New Guinea are going to think the same way? There's no reason to think that. And so what a moral realist could say is, look, college students are the weird ones. Actually, everyone else is a realist.
Yeah, the second thing I should point out, I wasn't presenting that as like a conclusive, argument or anything.
Oh, of course
it was just
not.
Something that sort of always struck me. It's like, yeah.
So there is a bit of tension there, and I think it's worth drawing attention to that because it at least demonstrates that you could get large populations of people that actually do find relativism fairly persuasive on the surface. But this is where they could make the second move, which is to argue that those students are confused or insincere or don't hold a legitimate metaethical position, that they are in some way conflating relativism as a metaethical position with normative standards like tolerance and respect for others. And that what students are really just doing is saying, look, I don't want to say other people are bad. I don't want to come off as intolerant and rude towards people or culturally insensitive. So I'm just going to say everybody's views are equally valid because I'm a good person. And they're not really expressing a substantive metaethical position. And I think there's probably some merit in that move as well. What do you think of that?
Yeah, that seems pretty reasonable, especially in light of the fact that, from what I've read about a lot of the actual research on this, it seems like a hell of a lot of people, even working in this field, find it sometimes difficult to distinguish, descriptive from metaethical relativism. So, I mean, are you going to expect laypersons or people just coming into the subject, new, to be able to make these sort of fine distinctions? But then I guess this in itself kind of brings us on to this question of, well, do lay people even have like a coherent metaethics, or is it just is it just like vague? Is it indeterminate, variable, depending on the moral judgment they make? So yeah.
Yeah, and this is why I would say that we should interpret research, as much as I really like what Pulsar and Wright have done, because taking a step back, the research on this specific question of whether non-philosophers are moral realists or anti-realists, that started in the early 2000s to late 2000s. There's a couple really central papers back at that time. Those papers were like a good start, but they had pretty significant methodological problems. And Pulsar and Wright have been at the forefront of identifying and attempting to correct for those previous methodological problems. And in spite of that, I remain skeptical. And part of the reason I remain skeptical is precisely this, that I'm not sure people without training in philosophy have determinate metaethical stances. One way to think about this is the analogy I use in my dissertation and when I talk about this topic with people, is if people are making causal claims, like I went to the store yesterday and I'm going to go to the store tomorrow or something like that, it would be very strange to ask, well, okay, but which account of quantum mechanics explains like the way that you're speaking? Like, what are you implicitly committed to when you speak about that in terms of your, like, how quantum mechanics would account for that? Do you endorse the Copenhagen view or the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics? Most people would have no idea what you're talking about. They don't have a stance on that, and they don't need one to make intelligible causal claims. And yet, there is a problem, which is that you can construct a study where you just present these two different interpretations of quantum mechanics to people and say, pick one. And let's say, 80% of people pick the Copenhagen account. Do you then get to say people's intuitive causal claims are implicitly committed to the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics? I would say no. You're forcing them to pick one. I mean, you could come up with fake philosophical distinctions and make people answer. So one of the immediate methodological problems with these studies is that everyone is assigned to some metaethical position. And that already stacks the deck against anybody that advocates for indeterminacy about folk metaethics like me, which is they use what I call, and it's called, forced choice paradigms. They have to pick a metaethical stance. So wherever the chips fall, you're going to say that they are some kind of realist or anti-realist.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, that makes sense. And I suppose I'm also thinking that there's going to be like several levels on which we can talk about the metaethical commitments that people have. So I suppose there's going to be like, do they make some sort of explicit commitment? Because I think, I mean, so one obvious difference I can think with the quantum mechanics case is that I think lay people, and I mean, this is just my experience, actually do sometimes talk about metaethics. I mean, maybe not quite like philosophers do, but, it's something that they seem to be, they have some understanding of, like, okay, here's the thing. I remember my brother, who has no interest in philosophy at all, just for example, right? I happened to have a book, it was Jesse Prinz's book, The Emotional Construction of Morals. And my brother saw the title of the book and then started talking to me about it. And he was clearly an intuitive moral sentimentalist along the lines of Prinz, because he seemed to have intuitive. But the point is, total layperson, no interest in philosophy, and yet still, seems to kind of have some sort of inclination one way or the other. But then there's also a question of, and I suppose this is relevant to what a lot of philosophers talk about, is that the discourse, like maybe the concepts themselves might have commitments that we're not aware of. I mean, kind of analogous to how when we talk about knowledge, for instance, or like the analysis of knowledge, I mean, presumably lay people don't really think of it in terms of like justified true belief versus other accounts. I would imagine. At least that's not something I've ever really encountered when talking to people who aren't philosophers. But then you can still make an argument on the basis of conceptual analysis that is what the concept of knowledge is. although I don't know, maybe it wouldn't be. Maybe even in that case, we should be going out and doing empirical research, and some people have tried to do that. So, but yeah, I mean, on any of these levels, there could be, disagreement among lay people. There could be just indeterminacy. So I guess that complicates things. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah. So there's at least a couple possibilities on the table. There's indeterminacy would be one explanation for how to best describe what's going on if you attempt to do this sort of descriptive metaethics and say, okay, what is it that when people are making claims like murder is wrong, what do they mean, metaethically speaking? Indeterminacy would say that they don't have there's no determinate way of indicating one or another account to be superior to the other as an explanation for what they mean. But it's also possible that people have variable commitments, and this can manifest in at least a couple of ways. It could be that when someone says murder is wrong, that they mean different things in different contexts. So if they say it in one social situation, it means one thing, and it means something else in a different situation. Or people could vary, where if they say murder is wrong, they're committed in some way to realism about that, but not if they say abortion is wrong. Mm-hmm. And there could be, and that you could call intrapersonal variation or pluralism in metaethical commitments. So it could be that regular people actually kind of have some realist and some anti-realist commitments.
Yeah.
Another possibility is that there could be variation between people. So it could be that one, say, very religious person, they're very consistently, when they make moral claims, they mean this is what God approves or disapproves of. Well, however you want to categorize that metaethically, they're consistent. But then someone else is an anthropologist, and they're very much buy into relativism, and they really have thought about it, even though they're not a professional philosopher, and they're very consistent in meaning it that way. And then you get interpersonal variation. What I suspect would happen if you go out and you actually just look, if you could somehow just scan everybody's brain and scan everything everybody's ever said, you would find that the vast majority of cases where people are making moral claims, there's probably no way to know. So there might be some epistemic barrier to knowing whether there's some determinate analysis, or there just literally is no fact of the matter, even in principle, about what they're committed to. But you will find these pockets of cases where people have reflected enough, like maybe your brother has, to have some degree of commitment, but that commitment could be inconsistent for that person across time and the context and situations and issues. And it could vary between people. And that creates a massive problem for conventional accounts of metaethics that try to have this uniform and determinate semantic thesis built into the metaethical theory. So like if you take an error theorist that just says moral claims are systematically false, what I tend to ask someone that says that, and they're another anti-realist, so we should be on the same side. They'll say, moral claims are systematically false. Well, which moral claims? Which ones are they talking about? And what I found when I ask people that is they'll often give me these sort of, they'll say like cases like murder is wrong. Okay, but that's like a toy case. That's not a thing someone actually said. Actual moral claims are claims like people out there are making. Mm-hmm. And that what they mean is an empirical question, and it could vary. So it seems very strange to presume without any actual empirical evidence that everybody means the same thing when they make these claims. There's like good theoretical reasons to think that might be the case, but it might not. And the empirical research that we have does not support that people are really consistent.
Yeah, I have to say, I've been inclined towards error theory for a little while, and part of the reason why is because I was quite convinced by like points that people like Richard Joyce have made, where the thought is that moral claims involve this commitment to an idea that there are categorical reasons for action, like reasons for action that are independent of our desires. But I have to say, I'm now coming around to the view that maybe this is just telling me something about how I think about moral claims. Like I, for one reason or another, am intuitively attracted to the idea that morality involves a commitment to categorical reasons for action, but I really can't see any justification for attributing that commitment to everybody else. I mean, that in itself is, now that I think about it, it's like that's a very substantive commitment to take about morality. It's not at all clear that the average person has anything like that in mind or is committed to anything like that. So I'm not really sure what position I should hold now. Maybe I should become an indeterminist slash variablist. But yeah, you know,
That's actually it's consistent with a sort of degree of error theory. So what
right,
I would
yeah,
tend to say is I'm an error theorist conditional on a person actually being committed to there being categorical reasons for action. So if that's what someone means, then they're subject to an error theory. If it's not what they mean, then they're subject to some other account. So if you go out and you look at what people mean, it could be that some people speak like relativists, some people speak like realists. The people that speak like realists are subject to an error theory. I don't know what to say about people that if they say murder is wrong, they just mean something like murder is inconsistent with my moral standards. Well, that's true, but it's not very interesting to me. So I share the same attitude you do, where like if someone's going to say that there are moral facts, I want those facts to be substantive. I want them to say what I'm doing is potentially wrong, that it matters, that I should care about it. And if they're just saying, well, it's my subjective attitude, okay, and what's that to me? So what I tend to say is that there's unfortunately, I don't think there's a sort of one size fits all anti-realism. What I tend to say is every account of realism that I've encountered is either trivial, like it's some type of naturalist account that doesn't even have any sort of normative oomph. They're just moral facts or facts about happiness. Okay, well, if I don't care about that, then I'm going to go home now. Like, I'm going to go do what I want anyway, if that's not what I care about. Or they're false, like some sort of error theory, or sorry, some sort of account that's like moral facts are facts about what God wants. Well, God doesn't exist, so error theory. Or they're unintelligible, so they'll appeal to terms and concepts that I can't make sense of, and I don't think they can make sense of, and I'm not sure what they're talking about. And I think it's because they don't know what they're talking about. So it's one of these three. It's not just one.
right, yeah, okay, yeah. I'm glad you said that, because so one of the things that I imagine some people might be wondering is if we commit ourselves to some sort of indeterminacy or variability thesis about moral language, then it might not be obvious how you can get to something like moral anti-realism, or it's going to be a bit more difficult because if you're going to be an anti-realist about something, it sounds like you're going to have to give some sort of account of what that thing is. So like if I say that God doesn't exist, I have to say what God is. And if it's the case that God can be anything from an omnipotent, omniscient, benevolent creator to just the universe as a whole, as like a pantheist might say, then if I'm like just not taking a stance on what God is, then why would I be an anti-realist about God, or how can I justify that? But I guess your point is, well, you have to adopt different approaches depending on what people have in mind.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That makes it really hard to characterize anti-realism, right? Because it's well, the reasons why I'm an anti-realist are going to differ depending on what it is I'm supposed to be an anti-realist about. And that makes the position kind of a passive and reflexive position where it has to be defined in terms of some other position that that may or may not be well specified.
Well, can we still say though that, like, I still want to say, for instance, well, it's not going to turn out that there are stance independent or mind independent moral facts. So like if I'm talking to somebody who's assuming cultural relativism as a metaethics, for instance, then I'm like, oh, okay, right, what they're saying is true, or perhaps what they're saying is true, right? Maybe there are moral facts from that framework, but even so, those facts are going to be dependent on whatever their culture happens to value, and it's not really obvious why I should care about that. I mean, even if I'm a member of that culture, right, I can just say, okay, who cares? I'm not interested in, I want to reform the culture. So, so I don't know. It seems like there's still going to be a way of maybe capturing the anti-realist commitment in that sense.
Yeah, I think the most straightforward way, if someone just said, what is your position? I would say, I believe that there are no stance-independent moral facts.
Right. Yeah.
and that would be it. But you could get someone coming along insisting that they're a realist, but that's not what they're a realist about. They're actually a realist. So, I mean, this is a dispute that I've had with some people where they want to say any position which holds that there are moral facts is a realist position, but that includes relativism.
Yeah.
And I don't know, some type of like ideal observer theory. Are those realist positions? I would say no, but someone could just disagree, and then it just becomes a pointless terminological squabble. That I don't particularly care about those. I think that they're a distraction from addressing substantive issues in philosophy.
Yeah, I mean, so, I tend to say, look, you can define realism however you want, right? I mean, that's just semantics. I have encountered, this seems to be a more common thing where there are people who are talking about like minimal realism, and that's just the view that moral claims express propositions and some of them are true, and that's it, right? And that struck me when I first encountered this as just a really weird way of defining realism. But then I looked at the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy page on moral realism, and that is one of the definitions of realism it gives. So, I mean, okay, if you want to say that, like, individual subjectivism and cultural relativism and quasi-realism and constructivism are all forms of realism, okay, go ahead. But that doesn't really seem to be what the people who call themselves realist are really trying to get at. I mean, I think that we can identify certain commitments that are common to philosophers who describe themselves as realists and say, there's something mistaken about that.
Yeah, I don't see people advocating those positions, and it's not very common for people to do so anymore, self-identifying as moral realists. So it seems a bit strange to call them moral realists. It'd be interesting to do a survey specifically on how, like, to ask people separately, what is your metaethical position and where do you fall on the realism, anti-realism axis? How would you categorize that position? Or to ask them how they would categorize other people's positions. Like, if you ask a bunch of philosophers, is constructivism a type of realism? What would they say? I don't know. Like, the PhilPapers survey, focuses on such a broad spectrum of questions, but since my interests are almost exclusively metaethics, I just want to ask 100 questions about metaethics and see where the chips fall on that, because I don't know the answer to those questions. This is a dispute I had with some people about how to interpret those results, the PhilPapers results, because when people just ask realism, anti-realism, and they agree with one of those positions, what is their view? I don't know what their view is.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Although it did have a question specifically about metaethics, didn't it? And it seemed like the majority chose non-naturalism or naturalist realism. So
that's
either
true.
way, mostly realist. Yeah. Okay, yeah. So I guess we should go back to this point you made about realism being either false, trivial, or unintelligible. So I guess the trivial versions are going to be. This is going to include, I assume, number one, people who think that like all you need to be a realist is for there to be like moral truths, where that can be that could even include like relativism and stuff. So my thought is that a lot of forms of naturalism end up seeming trivial to me, in that when you look at what like moral naturalists are trying to do, there's often this idea that, well, we can define moral concepts in such a way that it turns out that these are properties that have some sort of explanatory role in empirical theories, and these are concepts that track closely enough with people's everyday moral judgments or something along those lines. And like if you've got that, then you can say you're a moral realist. You've got like a naturalist form of you've reduced morality to those natural properties. And I always tend to think, well, the issue that I always have with this is that it seems to me that there's like a whole load of different natural properties that, like, we can think of other normative systems, right, that we would similarly be able to identify with particular natural properties. So it's like, if you think about, I don't know, a kind of maybe more or less, utilitarian type moral system where, we care about like reducing harm and promoting pleasure and so on, then, okay, we can maybe identify that with like natural properties in the world. But similarly, you can imagine a more, I don't know, like maybe more sadistic sort of moral system, or maybe not even sadistic. Maybe think of something like, I don't know, the sort of Roman moral values. I'm not actually entirely sure what Roman moral views were, but let's say that this is like more about, I don't know, honor and strength and so on, and like that kind of thing. Well, you can similarly find natural properties to identify with that, and those natural properties would track closely with their moral concepts. So it's still, from the sort of point of view of somebody who's trying to decide what their commitments are and what sort of normative system should guide them. There's like in itself, both of these things are just inert. I don't know if that made sense.
It does, and that's exactly the kind of view that's encompassed by the sort of out of the three prongs you could go down. It includes both accounts that identify realism so broadly that it includes relativism and constructivism and a bunch of stuff that just don't tell me what I need to do.
Yeah.
But this also includes accounts of naturalism for precisely the point that you make. To me, these naturalist accounts end up, for the most part, unless they explicitly try to do otherwise, just offering exactly that, inert. I actually use precisely that term, inert, descriptive accounts. And, you could think of moral systems like the Romans that we would find, really objectionable, but maybe they could finesse that by saying, okay, but they were implicitly committed to the same moral values we are, but they were just wrong about the non-moral facts. And they thought that slavery and crucifying people and being really brutal was like the best way to realize human flourishing. And that's what morality is about. And they were just wrong about it. But just set all that aside and just reach right for the top shelf. You could just imagine a species from another planet that evolved under radically different conditions than us. And it's not even a moral system. It's just a different normative system. And they're committed to this alternative normative system that involves like sadistically torturing, killing, and conquering every other species in the universe. And there would be natural facts about that. Like you could make all these linkages between their speech and the normative system that they're committed to, and natural facts about the world. Okay, and you could describe that. Okay, so you have a type of naturalist realism about that normative system. Now what? Like that doesn't tell me what I should do with my life. All that would do is give me a very comprehensive account of how horrible they are and how much I hate them and hope that they don't come here and try to kill us all. It's just human morality would just be potentially the same thing, just less extreme. Let's say it turns out the natural moral facts are facts about, like, there's accounts, the Strelny and Fraser account. Moral facts are facts about cooperation. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, what if I don't want to cooperate? Now what? So should I cooperate anyway? Why? So so there's facts about what promotes cooperation. What's that to me? So yeah, I have the same attitude. These accounts end up just saying that there's facts, and the facts don't give me any guidance at all towards what I should do, how I should live my life. How is that a moral? They're moral facts, but they have nothing to do with what I should do. Well, that's not a moral system.
I guess the naturalist would say, well, yeah, like you morally should cooperate, but you don't want to. So okay, fine, you don't care about morality, but I mean, we can't compel everybody to care about morality. It is ultimately up to you, but still there are moral facts that bind you. I guess would be the line they would take.
They could try to take that line, but I could just point to this alien civilization and say, there's Zorpian facts about how you should torture and kill everybody. So you should do that. Zorpianly, you should do that. Morally, you shouldn't. Now, how do I decide whether I should be Zorpian or moral or neither or both? I don't think they're going to have a good answer to that. So that, they could say all they want. Morally, you should do this. Okay, I don't care about being moral.
Yeah, I think it's something where I'm kind of inclined to say to this sort of position, like, well, all right, then fine. I mean, it turns out, like, per the way you're using terms, that I'm a moral realist, but like if all that amounts to is the claim that there are certain natural facts which I believed in anyway, and which don't have any like force over me, you know, which aren't constraining my behavior in any sense, who cares? Like, you've
Right.
drained it of any interest for me. I mean, and it also, I mean, I say who cares, but like, actually, the very fact that I'm able to take that attitude, to me, suggests that's not really what I had in mind, at least when I was talking about morality. Like, morality has to be more substantive than that, at least to me.
Yeah, this is where there's a certain, I don't know if I call it ironic, but a certain respect in which I kind of just agree with Moore. And I just don't think that you're going to be able to naturalize morality. But whereas I think that moral realists are inclined to take from that, okay, well then, you know, let's consider various potential accounts of non-naturalist realism. So like, I think that we could just think for Morean reasons, let's set aside naturalism, it's never going to work. Great. Okay. So what that does not entail is therefore some non-naturalist account of moral realism is true. It just means it's the only contender. And that's, to me, where the whole discussion should start. Because the naturalist accounts, I just think that they are fundamentally misguided in addressing the question that I want addressed. I want to know, is there a fact of the matter about what I should do morally that applies to me or has authoritative force over me in a certain sort of way that I don't see how naturalism can capture it? Like, in principle, I don't see how it could do so. I guess, and maybe you're more familiar with some accounts of naturalism that I might not be. Are there accounts of naturalism that try to sort of obtain or like sort of acquire the force that non-naturalist accounts of realism seem to manage more easily?
I mean, I think that they try to, but I have not encountered any that I find successful. And I think actually most naturalists will accept that they're not really getting you what, you know. So like, actually, I just recently was rereading Peter Railton's Moral Realism article, and you know, that's one of the more I think more popular naturalist accounts, and he just outright says like, okay, yeah, you're not actually going to get categorical reasons for action on this. You know, what he wants to say is it turns out that like the vast majority of us do care, and maybe we are in some sense compelled to care about what he thinks morality is. So on his account, morality is what he calls social rationality. It's about trying to you know, maximize the interests of everyone considered impartially, basically. And he says, you know, well, basically everybody already does care about this, and if you are like, even if you're an egoist, say, you know, talking with other people, you're going to be put into a situation where you have to like justify your behavior to others. So, you know, it's like, sure, you know, we can imagine somebody who has completely different like ends and goals, but that's none of us. The problem that I have with that is that I think that he's just wrong, that everybody is already like implicitly committed to this way of thinking. I think it's probably true that everybody, you know, it's maybe true that we sort of have to adopt like a non-egoistic perspective, but there's many ways of doing that. You know, so yeah,
It's still, you know, two things I would say is, one is I just straightforwardly don't think that that's true. The first thing that comes to mind is many people have parochial attitudes, and they would favor one social group over another at the expense of the other, and they might even moralize harming or not assigning moral worth to people outside of their group. And you know, this is a broader issue that I have, and this is part of the reason I was interested in the psychology of metaethics. Metaethics is almost exclusively conducted by people from similar demographic backgrounds, similar cultural backgrounds. You know, it's almost entirely people that grew up in the Western Christian world, and they've been absolutely inundated with, you know, a mass, like the Venn diagram of what practicing publishing metaethicists in contemporary metaethics have been exposed to culturally and academically. There's just a bunch of circles on top of each other. And then they want to extrapolate, well, pretty much everybody cares about what I care about. How do you know that? Like these people, and I don't know about Railton at all, but typically seem to me to maybe not have fully considered anthropological data, psychological data, like cross-cultural research on how people from different societies think. Uh, people think very different. And are you familiar with the WEIRD acronym?
Yeah.
Yeah. So for anyone that's
Western,
not familiar,
educated, industrialized, and now you will have to finish it off because I've
rich and democratic. Right. So, so even the psychological research has been mostly conducted on weird populations. And this is a point to go all the way back to what we were talking about at the beginning. You can't say very much about the fact that the most recent and best designed studies in metaethics appear to show most people are inclined towards some type of anti-realism, that therefore like people are inclined towards anti-realism, because the vast majority of those subjects are people in the United States. A lot of the samples come from Amazon's Mechanical Turk, which is people that get paid to fill out surveys. Mm-hmm. And those are frequently only in the United States, and college students. And those two groups are not demographically representative of people around the world. Now, that weird acronym, that comes from Henrich's work. And what they did when they looked at the cross-cultural research is they didn't just find that people from weird societies like the United States are not particularly good at representing people. If you go and survey people in New Guinea and Fiji and Africa and just wherever you go in the world, they're the least representative. So they actually tend to anchor one or the other end of a distribution. So if you have like the most extreme in this particular psychological behavior or metric, it's usually weird populations. Either they're the least likely to do something or the most likely to do something. So the samples that we have about people just don't tell us very much about what humans are like. And yet moral philosophers are perfectly content saying people think like realists. Well, which people? Do people in Mongolia think like realists? Yeah, I don't know. So there is now some cross-cultural research that's even finding that it's not entirely obvious that every language lexicalizes moral terminology in a way that, like, pretty much at all. Like, there's not clearly like cognate terms. Mm-hmm. They have like kind of similar terms, but they don't really map on very well. And, it's like fitting two pieces of a jigsaw puzzle together that don't really fit. Do those societies are they committed to realism? How could they be if they don't even seem to have the same kind of normative concepts? I mean, that's something that philosophers don't seem to even consider, mm-hmm. much less grapple with.
Yeah, I want to come back to this point, though I suppose it's just to say something in defense of naturalists. I mean, they usually want to take the line that we postulate moral properties for essentially the same reason as we, would postulate any other properties in our best, theoretical account of the world. And, obviously, I mean, when people talk about protons and neutrons, well, you're not going to find people in other societies talking about those things. You postulate them because they have a role to play in our best explanations of things. And, I suppose if somebody could come up with some theory of social phenomena that gave us really good novel predictions that involved postulating moral properties, there might be something to be said for that, maybe. Although I actually think that in practice, the explanations that realists have given on this point are pretty poor. It's usually stuff like, oh, well, how do we explain the sort of general trend towards liberalism over time, that kind of thing. But what was my point? Oh yeah, like that's maybe something they would say in defense, like, if you think of it as being a theoretical postulate, which is supported by the explanatory power of the theory, maybe it doesn't matter so much what people are actually thinking of, when they make.
Yeah, I would agree with him about that. Mm-hmm. I do think it puts some pressure on their accounts. And part of this comes from research in psychology because, a theory about protons or something like that is not something I would have expected to figure into ordinary language. But something like, say, personality traits, you would expect, if there were shared personality traits across cultures, for people to have at least somewhat overlapping terminology for referring to those. So people that are more conscientious or more extroverted, you would expect, if people in other cultures also have a sort of extroversion-introversion dynamic, that they would also have terminology for that. And it turns out that they do. You don't really find cultures that have radically different terminology for personality. You will find differences. It's not the case that every personality setup all over the world is the same in every culture. Culture does influence it, but there are still commonalities. But if you found a culture that had no terminology that overlapped with ours and their personality dynamics were totally different, I think that would be meaningful. That would matter. So if you do find cultures that don't carve up the normative landscape in a way that seems to deliver this concept of morality, because morality is so socially and psychologically embedded in our everyday practices, I do think that would create some issues for a naturalist about morality, or it wouldn't for a naturalist about like chemistry.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I want to move on to the other parts of the trilemma, false and unintelligible. I don't know. Could you say a bit about so like why would some forms of realism be unintelligible?
Right. So it might be easier to first say why some would be false, which is that if they're implicitly committed to premises, like there's some argument that they have for the moral realist account. So like, for instance, if someone's by saying murder is wrong, they mean murder is inconsistent with what God wants us to do, then provided that you could justify the claim that God does not exist, that claim would be false. So it might be intelligible, but it's not true because there is no God who holds this attitude. So you could deal with that. There's, I keep giving that example just because it's easy, but it could be that if you think morality requires free will, but people don't have free will, then your moral claims could be systematically false. Of course, there is the question of whether the particular concept of free will that you have in mind is itself intelligible. It may or may not be, but just grant that it is intelligible, then fine, it's false because we don't have free will, would be one potential position you could take. So setting aside why it's false, the unintelligible one comes from specific types of realist accounts that I encounter, and they're almost always the non-naturalist ones. And the ones I primarily have in mind would be Mike Humer, Derek Parfit, specific types of non-naturalists that argue for categorical reasons. My stance on that might be more extreme than yours, or than most anti-realists, because I don't typically hear them say that these positions are literally unintelligible. And by unintelligible, I mean that in the full-throated sense of the term. It would be like, if I said, flubba-lubba-lubba-lub, that doesn't mean anything. Or I could come up with, and I'm not sure what to make of something like square circle. Is that unintelligible? Do we say self-contradictory things are intelligible, but just like self-evidently false? I'm not sure where I stand on whether these accounts are self-contradictory or oxymoronic or category mistakes or something, or whether I literally just don't know what the people talking about them making these claims are talking about, but it's one of the two. So you have something like, Parfit might say that you have decisive reason not to act so as to bring about agony for non-instrumental purposes, something like that. I don't know what he's talking about. So, when someone says you have a reason, like philosophers talk about normativity and reasons, they'll say something like you have a reason not to cause people unnecessary suffering. I don't know what that means. How do you have a reason? So like if you ask me, why did you go to the store? I might say to buy milk. And one way I could say that is to use the terminology of reasons. I could say the reason I went to the store is to buy milk. That was the reason I went. And if I put that in moral terms, I might say something like the reason I didn't steal is because I think that that's wrong. So I can use the term reason. It's not like I'm bereft of the concept of a reason. It's just, to me, reasons are cashed out in terms of the relation between some evaluative or normative standard and some means of acting consistently or inconsistently with that standard. They're relational. They only make sense relationally. But the realists like Parfit and Humer want to say that there are these sort of non-relational, like something you could just have a reason. I don't know what that can mean in principle. And when I have asked realists what they mean by that, they'll just say it's a primitive concept, or it's unanalyzable, or it's properly basic, or they'll use various sorts of terminology where they explicitly acknowledge that they've exhausted the means of explaining what the concept means.
Yeah,
I think we could pause there for you to take stock of that.
Sorry?
Oh, sorry, never mind. Go ahead.
No, I'm going to say I have, I think, similar worries, but I want to commit myself to the claim that it's unintelligible? I'm not sure. I guess I just feel like maybe I am missing something here. When people talk about reasons, okay, I ask myself, what exactly is a reason, right? Because I take it that I do have reasons to do stuff. There are people who've defended like just straightforward skepticism about reasons in general, just globally. I'm not sure I would want to take that position, because I feel like if I just think about a very everyday case, let's say I'm feeling cold and I don't want to be cold anymore. I see a coat. I think, okay, I ought to put the coat on, or I have a reason to put the coat on. Well, it seems to me like all that really amounts to is, I'm feeling cold. I have the desire not to be cold, and by putting the coat on, that would stop me from feeling cold without interfering with any other desires that I happen to have, right? Like, so that's it. That's pretty much all when I think about talking about reasons, it seems like I can pretty much just reduce them to desires. But of course, there are all of these accounts that say, no, there's fatal problems with that kind of view. And at that point, I lose any sense of what reasons are supposed to be. So yeah, I think that I have similar worries here, but I also think maybe I am just missing something. I don't know. One of the concerns that I have about this point with respect to reason being a primitive concept is that, so I think that what realists will do is they'll say, well, it's not like we just talk about reasons, right? We have this concept of reason that's implicated or has connections to whole loads of other concepts, like value and normativity and oughts and so on, right? Like it's not like we just talk about reasons. We talk about reason, and it has all these relations to other concepts, and we can analyze it in that way. And one of the worries that I have about the arguments that sort of attack the very notion of reason is that, isn't this ultimately just going to be the case for almost all of our concepts? I mean, it kind of reminds me of Quine's attack on the analytic synthetic distinction, where he's like, well, you can, how are we going to define analyticity, right? Well, you can define analyticity in terms of necessity, but what the hell is necessity? Well, we can define necessity in terms of synonymy, but hey, what's synonymy? And it ends up being the case that we can't nail down any of these concepts. But then, I don't know. It's sort of like, well, first of all, pretty much isn't that the case for any concept? I mean, look at attempts to define a concept like knowledge. Every attempt anyone's ever made to give a definition of knowledge has failed. And also, once you have a concept that's used in a discourse regularly and has connections to lots of other concepts, is it even a problem that we can't give a definition of it? I'm just not sure. I'm not sure. That's
this is to me like the central struggle that I have with these issues, and I think we'll get to this later, like what the best argument for realism is. But one of them might be that anti-realists just aren't getting it. We're just not getting it somehow. But there's got to be some criteria for distinguishing legitimately primitive concepts from ones that are illegitimate, because if realists, if we're going to permit them, sort of just say, okay, fine, you get to have your primitive concepts, what is to stop anyone from saying any concept is primitive and is therefore just totally exempted from justification? I could just say theism it's like just primitive concept that God exists, so God exists. QED, end of discussion, there's nothing else to say. Anyone could do that for anything, and it doesn't seem to me like we should allow for that we should just accept as a acceptable dialectical move that someone can just claim something is primitive. So that would be one thing I would say about that. The other is that there's this concept that I really like that came from the less wrong community. It's like the rationality people. I don't know if you're familiar with them at all. Yeah. But there's this sort of slogan that beliefs should pay rent. That if you believe something, in a certain sense, there's got to be something that you could do with that belief, that it should figure in some way into your deliberations or the way you go about doing things, or what the future experiences you anticipate. It should allow for predictions. It should have some sort of practical guiding role in the way that you think about things. Now, realists may very well argue, and I think they would argue, that the concept of reasons that they have in mind does have this role. It's unclear to me that it does. And the way that those conversations go down would be that if, someone that endorses Parfit or Hume's conception of realism comes along and says, you have a reason to not do X, what I'm going to say is, okay, well, what is that reason? Like, why shouldn't I do X? And if the answer is, no, you don't understand, you just have a reason, that's not going to satisfy me. What does that mean? I have a reason. And then, some people might make this move to say, well, it means that the fact that Xing, like the fact that if you X'd, it would result in outcome Y or something, counts in favor of you not doing it. Well, counts in favor. What does that mean? So sometimes what they'll do is they'll just define a term that seems meaningless to me in terms of another term that also seems meaningless, and we just get caught in this loop. Another way that I've seen this go down is they might say, well, you shouldn't do it because it's immoral. Okay, well, what does it mean to say it's immoral? Well, it means it's like bad for you to do it. It's like morally bad. Okay, well, what does that mean? Well, it means that you shouldn't do it, or it means that you have a reason not to. Like, you get into this endless loop that doesn't get anywhere, where it's still unclear to me why I shouldn't do it. But if someone were to say, well, you shouldn't do it because if you do, I'm going to punch you in the face. Well, I don't want to get punched in the face. So now I feel like I do have a reason to not do it. I don't want to get punched in the face. That seems like a reason. So when I think about reasons, it always seems to circle back to, if you're going to tell me I have a reason to do something, if it doesn't in some way tie in to my goals and values and my inclinations, it doesn't seem like it could be motivationally relevant. Like, why would I care? And yeah, if you can tie it into my interest and goals, it does seem like it matters. So that seems to me to be important. Why shouldn't we appeal to reasons that, like, you could say you have a concept of reasons that don't matter, fine. Then I care about reasons that do matter to me, given my goals and values.
Yeah, I think, do realists claim that reasons are necessarily motivationally relevant? I mean, I feel like they would just accept that, somebody might just have a psychology where they're not properly responsive to reasons, so they're not motivated by them. And then, I mean, I don't know what work the concept of reason is doing either. This is something that confuses me as well, but I feel like they would probably just accept that.
Right. They might be an externalist about motivation. They might just say, sure, okay, you have a reason not to torture babies or whatever, but maybe you don't care about that. They can do that, but then so there's all these reasons, there's all these moral reasons out there for doing and not doing things that, if they tie into our motivations and personal, like our subjective values, then they matter. But if they don't, then they don't matter to us. Like, by matter, I mean like matter from a subjective perspective. That seems like a very weirdly inert set of facts. That it seems to make these realist moral facts sort of subordinate to our motivation and our subjective values, even if you're an externalist about motivation. So, okay, well, what like argumentative or persuasive role would that serve? So, like, suppose some people come over to us and they say, look, we figured out what the realist moral facts are. And the facts are, like, you should slam your face into a wall or scream at tables all day. Like, you have a reason to do it. And then you say, okay, but I have no psychological desire I have no desire to do that, no motivation. Then what do they do? Oh, well, okay, well, I guess you don't. Goodbye. You have the reasons, just letting you know, but that doesn't matter to you, so goodbye. Like, what happens?
I guess actually this sort of links into this point you made earlier about, what was it, Zorpian facts?
Yeah.
I think, yeah, because, I mean, okay, there are going to be moral reasons, but presumably we can just imagine like other normative systems which generate other reasons. And I mean, this would be this, like, you don't even have to, because I guess when it comes to claims like, oh, well, you have a moral obligation to slam your head into a wall, realists that I've encountered will always say, well, look, right, when you actually, what we have to do here is get into the normative theory, and morality clearly doesn't work that way. That's not what the moral facts are. But I can just say, all right, well, there's this other, right, there's this other system, right, Zorpian facts, I guess, or, whatever, maybe like, Roman values or whatever. They would generate reasons as well. If you have moral reasons, you're going to have Zorbian reasons. You're going to have reasons related to the Roman value system. So yeah, then it's like it. Well, I don't know. I don't know because I find this difficult to comprehend as well. So yeah.
Yeah, it seems like there's this sort of infinite possibility space of different normative systems that could be out there, and I don't see why moral reasons should be any more compelling than any of these other systems. And one reason that might matter is that a lot of the arguments that moral realists make for moral realism could be adapted for one of these other arguments. I mean, this is a sort of standard move I make, and maybe it's a lame debater's move, but when people present the companions in guilt argument for moral facts and they try to link those to epistemic facts, you could just swap out moral facts as Zorbian facts, and if a Zorbian presented it, I don't see why it would work for moral facts but not Zorbian facts. So if we accept epistemic categorical epistemic norms, we got to accept, and therefore we have to accept categorical moral norms. What about categorical Zorbian norms? Why would we have to accept moral norms and not Zorbian norms? And if we do have to accept both, just build on that. Now I could just keep adding to the list. I could come up with Florpian and Dorpian and Scorpion, whatever. Now we've got an infinite list. What do we do with that list? Why should we care about the moral ones in particular? And I don't think there's a good answer to that. I think I would love to hear what a realist would say to that kind of move. Well, I don't know what they'd say.
Any realists who are watching this, feel free to comment. I guess, yeah. Okay, so I think that covers it then. Realism, false, trivial, unintelligible. Oh, I should ask, by the way, how much time do you have? I mean,
I got plenty of time.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so I wanted to talk about. Well, this is maybe a general question about philosophy, but I know we've sort of mentioned the PhilPapers survey, and you'd mentioned to me that this had raised concerns for you about philosophy as a field. I guess, yeah, the PhilPapers survey. My reaction to it was surprise at just how popular, not just moral realism, but other similar sort of views were. So I think there's a question on well-being, for example, which, if I recall correctly, I think it was over 50% of philosophers accept objective list theories of well-being, which to me just seemed completely crazy. And I think that they usually appeal to the same sorts of arguments that you get for the idea of like these desire independent reasons. So it'll be stuff like, well, clearly somebody could have the desire to just spend their entire life counting blades of grass, but like obviously that would be an unworthy existence, right? Like there are certain things that objectively make for a good life. So it's not just moral realism. It seems like there are, and how many? I think there was almost sort of 40% aesthetic objectivists as well. Which
I'm looking at it now. Yeah. It's 43.5%.
Which is like, I mean, it kind of ruins it for anti-realists like us, because I know that a sort of move I would want to make would be the thing that I'm always sort of inclined to say, just intuitively, like a thing that I always want to say when I encounter moral realists is like, surely objective moral value. I mean, what? You don't believe in like objective value about, whether chocolate ice cream or vanilla ice cream is better. But I don't know, if you accept aesthetic realism, maybe there is a fact of the matter there, So
I don't know if you're aware of this, but do you go to the metaethics conference?
I don't know.
Okay, so there was a talk there where the author did in fact argue for realism about like gastronomic realism.
Yeah.
And they specifically used the example of ice cream flavors.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Wait, so hang on. There's somebody who literally has argued for this.
Yes, recently, like a few months ago.
What was their conclusion? Is it chocolate ice cream or vanilla ice cream?
The argument is I don't know if I could reconstruct the argument from a presentation I saw like a few months ago, but it's genuinely more interesting than I might be inclined to give realist accounts that actually allow for gastronomic realism credit for. And one thing you could at least give it credit for is consistency.
Yeah.
You know, if so, that's a few things counting in its favor. What was interesting about it is that the part of the idea was, if I recall correctly, and again, I could just be getting this wrong, is that at least one thing you could point out is that if things in the world, if we were capable of detecting sort of intrinsic value or stance-independent value in those things, that our sensory faculties could be different from one another, and that could give us differential access to different features of those things that have this stance-independent value. So it could be that if I like, peanut butter ice cream and you don't like it, but you like mint ice cream or whatever flavor you like, it could be that something about our neurophysiology and our sensory systems is giving us differential access to elements of those two experiences that are in fact valuable. I thought that was interesting. It could be, for instance, maybe we find certain paintings aesthetically unappealing, but aliens from another planet that have different types of photoreceptors could see beauty in them that we couldn't. I don't know.
Yeah.
So like there, you're accessing their objective beauty properties, and I just don't have a physiology to do it. So that, I think, figured part into their account, which I thought was interesting. I don't accept that because I think there's easier explanations, but
I guess, I don't know the argument, and you don't want to speak for them, but my initial thought is, well, how are we distinguishing between cases where people are detecting objective value and cases where they're just not? Because, in principle, it seems like you could have a being that has a neurophysiology that...
Sorry about that.
In principle, it seems like you could have a being that has a neurophysiology that responds to like anything, right? Anything imaginable. In fact, it's not even that hard, right? Like there are people who get an enormous amount of pleasure from inflicting suffering on others, for example. And maybe there could be somebody who enjoys watching paint dry. I think Andy Warhol once said that he liked being bored, which is, why he made films. Like he did a film called Empire, which was just 8 hours of a static shot of the Empire State Building. So like, I don't know. So are we just then going to say that well, everything is like of equal objective value?
Yeah, I don't know how they would handle those issues, and I can't speak for them. But it's worth looking into that and exploring the implications of that kind of view. But yeah, it does kind of take the teeth out of what I like to present as reductios, and gastronomic realism is my go-to. I make posts about it on Facebook. Like just yesterday, I was arguing that because the necessity of maintaining homeostasis requires you to consume and extract resources from the environment, and that this evolved prior to people even having mental states, that actually norms about what you should and shouldn't eat are actually precede moral norms, and that actually all types of normativity are fundamentally gastronomic normativity, and it's actually the most fundamental normative system. And of course, I'm not being serious. I'm in a certain sense, I'm kind of making fun of moral realism, but part of the point is to just illustrate that there isn't sufficient discussion on how to delineate different normative domains and speak meaningfully about the metanormative differences between those domains. Because I think you could actually make a surprisingly decent case for gastronomic realism, to the extent that you could make a similar case as there is for moral realism. I see that as a problem for moral realism, but apparently some people actually see that as a reason for actually reconsidering a much more broad realism about value.
Yeah. Well, hey, what if 43% professional philosophers accept aesthetic value realism? Then I guess they wouldn't be troubled by that. So.
But you raise the issue of this being a problem for academic philosophy, that these proportions are as high as they are.
Well, it was something that you've mentioned to me in our conversations in the past. So, it was. I'm not sure that I see it as a problem for philosophy, right? But I think you've mentioned that you do. So, Yeah, I'm asking.
Yeah, sorry if it may have sounded like I was attributing the position to you, but I meant to just say this is something that you brought up, and I was trying to return to that topic. Yeah, but so I can kind of just say why, which is that I don't my position is that as far as I could tell, I don't think there are. It's not just that I don't think that there are good arguments for moral realism, because I don't think that there are, but when I look at the arguments, and I mostly am familiar with metaethics, but like I've looked at arguments in other fields. I mean, you go through philosophy education, you read your epistemology and your metaphysics. I'm not a specialist in those areas, but the arguments for moral realism seem sort of uniquely bad. And I would say for normative realism in general, same thing would apply to aesthetics. They seem worse than the arguments in other areas in philosophy. It doesn't seem like there's a degree of balance or symmetry in the quality of the arguments, specifically with respect to moral realism. And I would have thought, if philosophers are experts at considering the philosophical merits of different positions, that this ought to be clear, that they ought to agree with me about this, and yet they don't. What I'm not saying is that every philosophical position I would take, if I went through the PhilPapers survey, I think if you disagree with me, it's a problem for philosophy. I don't think that at all. It's the aesthetic and moral realism in particular. That troubles me.
Yeah, I suppose the obvious response is going to be that you're missing something, right? Like, I mean, given that there's so many presumably quite smart people who've thought through this stuff, who are good at constructing arguments, I mean, isn't it more likely that we're the ones who are missing things here? I don't know. Although, having said that, I mean, some moral realists are quite open about this. I remember reading, I think it was David Enoch's Taking Morality Seriously. And yeah, he says in the introduction to it, I think, that generally speaking, what realists have done is just respond to objections. Or at least he's talking about robust realists, like non-naturalist realists. Generally, they've just responded to objections. They haven't given positive arguments for the view. But then, I mean, I suppose, to speak in defense of them here, okay, so if you're accepting, like, a broadly sort of, Morean type approach to epistemology, right, where you're saying that it's important that we, capture people's common sense commitments, and you think that realism is the common sense position, then maybe it makes sense from that point of view that that's all you would need to do is respond to the alternatives, and then you've just you're left with realism just as the sort of, well, that's the default. So
yeah, I guess I think that that's probably right, and that's probably why. I mean, maybe that's part of what's motivating me to push against the sort of presumption in favor of realism. If it turns out that it's not true that realism is a common sense view, I think that creates at least some problem for anybody that's taken that sort of dialectical position. Like, we're the default, you've got to knock our position down. And that does seem to be the position that I don't. Well, you have someone like Humer's phenomenal conservatism. Have you done a video on that or done anything about that?
No, I haven't actually. I don't think so. But it's something I've been planning on talking about for a while. So who knows whether I'll get around to it.
Because that would be a good one to address, because there's a difference between saying, like, the common sense view is realism, and therefore we as a community of philosophers need to treat that as the default and then consider arguments against it, and what Humer is doing. Because what Humer is saying is, well, if it seems like it's true to me as an individual, I have some prima facie justification for believing it. It may be defeasible, but like, you've got to convince me otherwise, because I'm justified in, well, however I'm initially inclined to think that that's the way that things are.
Yeah.
Those are different, and even if so, realists could retreat to that, even if you could show ordinary people are not inclined towards realism.
Yeah.
They could just say, okay, but we're inclined towards realism, and then they could make some move like saying, okay, fine, but like, they could point to me and say, yeah, but the only reason you don't think, like Lance, don't think that people are realistic because you think they haven't thought about it. Or like, it's not part of the way that they think about things, in the same way that people haven't thought about quantum mechanics. but that wouldn't be a good like you wouldn't make that move in quantum mechanics where if it seemed like the many worlds or Copenhagen interpretation, like two experts, if 95% of them said this is clearly the right one, they're not going to be impressed by pointing out that the vast majority of people don't have a position on the matter. Mm-hmm. And I think realists can make that same move and appeal to phenomenal conservatism. And so then I think you need to deal with that principle and how it's being applied in this particular case.
Yeah, I find phenomenal conservatism as a principle, it seems like it seems, it seems like it maybe I accept something like that. I mean, because there's a sort of point that Hume makes that where he says, it's just not clear, like, I mean, ultimately when it comes to like what our fundamental assumptions are, it's not obvious how else we get any beliefs. It seems like all of our beliefs are going to rest on seemings, broadly speaking. I think there might be something to that. But the issue in this particular case for me is just, well, it doesn't seem to me that realism is true. And when I make moral judgments, it doesn't seem to me that I'm like describing facts in the world. So when I say that you ought not to torture babies, I do very strongly hold this position. I think torturing babies is awful, but it doesn't seem to me to be the case that it is a fact that you ought not to torture babies. It seems more like I'm expressing something about my own values. So, I don't know. I don't know. Where you then go from there, right? I mean, Michael Hume says that it seems to him that there are these moral facts, and I say it seems to me that there aren't. So, I feel like you just have a kind of stalemate there. And I also think that in philosophy, surely what we should be doing is. The point is you're supposed to offer justifications for your positions, right? Like it's not. Yeah, I don't know where you go from there. Surely we're going to need more than just appealing to how it seems.
To be fair to Hume, he is one of the people that does offer sort of externally valuable arguments because he appeals to the argument from convergence, and I think he has the ontological argument. So he has a sort of arsenal to convince the skeptics. But when if like we dispensed with all those arguments, there would still be phenomenal conservatism and it serving as a justification for moral realism. And I share your concern about that because I would have thought one of the central purposes of philosophy as a collective activity is for us to present sort of publicly valuable arguments where I could assess the reasons. And if I consider the reasons good, I adopt the position. But for someone to just come along and say, I'm justified in believing how things seem to me, unless you could provide defeaters for that view, well, okay, sure, you are justified in that. But like that, to me, that seems very sort of dialectically inert and trivial. Because, it's a point I've made in discussing this topic is someone could come along and say, look, I was out in the woods, I saw Bigfoot, like up close. Like Bigfoot ran right by me. I know Bigfoot is real. Like I saw it with my own eyes. I was not on drugs. I know what I saw. And they are they justified in thinking that they saw a Bigfoot? Maybe they are. Maybe there's no good defeasible reasons. The thing is, like, if they say that and they're justified in believing in Bigfoot, and then they were having a debate, does Bigfoot exist? Imagine someone saying that, like, I saw Bigfoot, so I know Bigfoot exists. Okay, well, do you have like a blood sample? Do you have fur? Do you have video evidence? Do you have footprints? No, I don't have any of that. I don't have anything that could convince you, but I'm justified in believing in Bigfoot. Like, we might just say, okay, but like this discussion is about whether like I and the audience should believe in Bigfoot. And I'll accept your testimony as some minimal evidence that maybe Bigfoot exists, but like it's not convincing. So I don't know what work dialectically phenomenal conservatism is doing. I do have a further concern about it, which is that if all it was being used for is the modest and reasonable work of saying it's not irrational to be a realist if it seems like realism is true and you haven't encountered defeaters, fine. But in practice, if you take someone like Hume, he assigns a near 100% probability to like moral claims like torturing babies is wrong. And my concern is that in practice, phenomenal conservatism can function as a de facto type of phenomenal dogmatism. Because what you could say, if you're a realist, is you could say, look, I assign like a prior probability of realism is basically close to 1. Like it's almost guaranteed that realism is true. And now the anti-realists, like, we marshal a thousand of the greatest arguments in philosophical history. And they could actually, from sort of Bayesian point of view, say, I fully accept the force of every single one of these arguments to the same degree you do. Like, I actually find the arguments as convincing as you do. But my prior is so high that once I do the Bayesian calculation, still seems like realism is true. And they could just do that. That's literally a consequence of their view, is to be functionally impervious to evidence and practice. Mm-hmm. That seems like a problem.
Isn't that the case for Bayesianism in general? At least you can assign whatever you want to your priors, and so it's not just phenomenal conservatives that this would be the case for.
No, it is a problem for anybody. But what I'm concerned with is that realists can use the principle of phenomenal conservatism to be unpersuaded and unresponsive to any argument for moral anti-realism in principle. Mm-hmm. And if the principle is used in practice that way, that's totally destructive to philosophical discourse, because if they're entitled to do it in that case, anyone is entitled to do it for anything. I could always just say any arguments you make for moral realism are less likely than the fact that anti-realism is true. And therefore anti-realism is true. Because of my intuitions.
Do they do this though? Like, I feel like I want to give realists some credit here. I do think that they engage with arguments, and it's pretty rare that I've met a realist who'll just be like, nope, right, realism is definitely true, and even though your arguments are convincing on their own terms, because I've assigned such a high prior to realism, I'm just not going to give it up. I don't know. It's not something I like. Usually they'll attack the arguments.
I haven't encountered anybody that's specifically said that, but I suspect that the confidence that realists often exhibit for realism serves as a sort of epistemic dam that prevents them from fully appreciating the force of anti-realist arguments. That does not at all absolve anti-realists of the responsibility to present good arguments. I don't think anti-realists, I don't think realists should be just saying, resting on their laurels and saying, I've got my intuitions, so I'm right, any more than anti-realists should. I don't do that. I don't say because it's intuitive, therefore I'm right. And I agree with you that realists they do engage with anti-realist arguments. But I have noticed a tendency for realists to be a bit more, at least this is my impression, and maybe I'm just wrong, and maybe this is just based on anecdotal experience, so I won't put it in comparative terms. I've noticed a tendency for some of the realists I've encountered to be incredibly dismissive towards anti-realism. Like, they'll engage with it, but as a fun intellectual exercise. They're not really willing to seriously entertain anti-realism.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I've probably encountered that too, but I don't know. I don't know if it's a common problem. I'm not sure. Yeah.
I don't know if it's made its way into any academic publications, but I have heard moral realists, and I've had so many discussions with realists, I can't keep track of which ones were like academics and which ones were lay people with various degrees of formal training or not. To me, it doesn't really matter. The quality of the argument stands on its own merits. But I have heard people say things like, any argument for anti-realism is going to fail because you just weigh the quality of that argument against anti-realism being false. And that's just so silly that we don't need to consider the argument. Okay, I've actually heard them say stuff like that.
Yeah, actually, no, you're right. Now that you're absolutely right. I have encountered this. It's a kind of, it's just the same as the sort of Morean move against external world skepticism. It's like, well, my belief that I have hands, right? I have hands, right? And any philosophical argument that you give to the effect that I don't have hands, that's going to include philosophical premises that are less plausible than the claim that I do have hands. And so similarly, it is a fact that it's wrong to torture babies, and any philosophical argument against that is going to appeal to philosophical premises that are less plausible than the claim that you ought to torture babies. No, that's actually a pretty common move that I've seen as well. So yeah.
Right. I just saw a paper. I can't remember who the author was, but it's like a very recent attempt. I'm not even sure if it's published. But yeah. Anyway, there are more Morean arguments for for moral realism that make that kind of move. That is a move they make. I don't know what to do with that. Yeah.
I think that, well, I mean, so the kind of line that I tend to take is to say, well, look, when you say you ought not to torture babies, right? I mean, I guess what I would do is to say, you know, obviously I agree with that, right? But, you know, you can endorse that and you can endorse it very strongly. But it's another question what sort of metaethical assumptions you bring to that, right? Like, I mean, I, as an anti-realist, can say you ought not to torture babies. So it's not just, if you're saying that, you know, you're comparing the plausibility, right? We're comparing the plausibility of philosophical premises in anti-realist arguments versus you ought not to torture babies. Then sure, there's some sense in which I find it more plausible that you ought not to torture babies because that's like a strong commitment that I have. But it's not that I'm committed to like a realist interpretation of that. Now, if you're saying that that a realist interpretation of you ought not to torture babies is true, so that it's like stance independently true that you ought not to torture babies, I would just then, I suppose I would then push that person, like on that realist interpretation. I mean, you can distinguish the normative claim from the metaethical assumptions you're making about it, and I think for the majority of people, actually, those metaethical claims are not going to be obviously more plausible than any anti-realist argument you can come up with. So I think that's probably what the sort of line I would usually take is to say that, yeah, I accept you ought not to torture babies, but you know, it's another question how you interpret the metaethics of that.
Yeah, that's exactly what I say. And this is there's a term that I've created for capturing the type of dialectical move that they make in these circumstances, which I'm calling normative entanglement. Mm-hmm. And what normative entanglement is it's capturing instances in which a realist, and it might be broader in application, but let's say they say something like, you know, do you think torturing babies is wrong? If you're an anti-realist, you have a couple responses. One is to think, oh, they mean in a realist sense. So the answer is no, I don't think torturing babies is wrong. Or you could say, yes, I do think torturing babies is wrong. And there's a problem with both responses. And the problem is that they have only made a normative claim and they have left underspecified the metaethical presuppositions implicit in that claim. And so if you say yes, they could say, aha, so you share my realist intuition. And then you have to backtrack and say, no. And they're like, nah, I gotcha. You're committed to the realist intuition. And now it's fine if as an anti-realist you want to override or reject that intuition, but you do have the intuition. And it turns out, no, I don't have the intuition because they have in mind a realist conception of that. But if you say no, think about that, how that sounds to an audience. Do you think torturing babies is wrong? No. Now it sounds like you actually think it's okay to torture babies. And that is not at all what we as anti-realists think. Maybe there are anti-realists that think that, but you're not committed to that in virtue of being an anti-realist. And so normative entanglement involves embedding the metaethical question in a normative question such that to respond to the question is to sort of, it's piggybacking the metaethical stance on top of the normative claim. And that has the rhetorical effect of making a denial of the claim make you look bad because it implies a rejection of the normative standard, while accepting it is implicitly agreeing with the realist. Yeah. And I don't think realists should do this. They should make the metaethical presupposition explicit. The problem is that it loses its rhetorical force once they do that. If they say, you know, if in front of an audience, isn't it clear, like, is it stance independently the case that one has decisive reason not to torture babies? Now I can say, no, it's wrong, but it's not stance independently wrong.
Yeah.
And that takes the teeth out of the rhetorical force of it. And so it's funny that it's to me, it's questionable that they don't do that. Why aren't they clear about the metaethical presuppositions? There's still a problem, though, because they could say something like, do you agree that it's objectively wrong to torture babies? If you say no, you're still going to look like you think it's okay to torture babies. So you see how they're embedding the normative claim in there? Because if you say no, there's still a sense in which you could say no, it's not objectively wrong, but it is inconsistent with my normative values. So there's still, even if you put that objective thing in there, there's still rhetorical force to asking the question that's inappropriate, it's illegitimate to imply that the anti-realist is not against torturing babies because they disagree with the metaethical position. And yet realists seem to do this, and they do it quite frequently. And I don't know why they do this, and they should be made aware of this and to stop doing it.
I remember when I first started doing my philosophy degree, I was doing a course. It was just a course on like ethics. Actually, it was a course on utilitarianism, Mill's utilitarianism, I think. And my lecturer, I can't remember why he was doing this, but it was probably just like one of those like introductory things to get the students involved and all that. But he was just asking people like what their moral stances were. And it's just like any Kantians, any utilitarians, and he went through these normative claims, and then he ended up with like any anti-realists or relativists, which immediately I thought, it sounds like you're kind of confusing the normative and the metaethics, but okay, anti-realist, yep, I'm an anti-realist. And there was a few of us that said we were anti-realists, and then he sort of made this face, he was like, ugh, and then he wrote on the board, the Holocaust was wrong, and said, right, so you don't think that's true. And kind of went into this like minor rant about how we were rejecting that the Holocaust was wrong. So this is, I mean, that's probably the worst example I've seen from a professional philosopher, but it happens. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a very clear case of it. One sort of comeback, like sometimes I like to use a little stupid gotchas. If they say something like that, I'll sometimes say, okay, well, unless you're a gastronomic realist, then you don't think any food is good. Because it's the same thing. It would be very silly to say that you cannot think cake tastes good unless you're a gastronomic realist. That's weird. And I think realists get that because most of them are probably not gastronomic realists. And so they understand that normative and evaluative language can be used in a straightforwardly non-realist way outside of morality. So why would they think that we couldn't use it in that way with respect to morality, even if they disagree with us? Because I'm an anti-realist. If you ask me, is the Holocaust wrong? I'm going to say, yes, it is wrong. It's abhorrent, it's disgusting, it's horrible. Like I have no, and I'm not being a fictionalist. I actually think it's wrong. I just don't mean what they mean by that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like that phrase, normative entanglement. That's
there. I haven't seen it in print, right. But I have seen it in on an interview with a philosopher where they basically said something like, "Look, either you think they first say the way you know that torturing babies is wrong is you think about it, you realize that it's morally wrong to torture babies, and they imply a sort of realist account there." Mm-hmm. And then they go on to say, some people, they don't think torturing babies is wrong, but typically that's going to be like a psychopath. And it's not explicit in that framing, but it seems to imply that either you're a realist or a psychopath.
Yeah.
And that is just, that's like incorrect. Let's say that's not true about the way that philosophical divisions are made. And it just seems to be conflating normative and metaethical considerations by implication. But I haven't seen anyone explicitly say you've got to be a realist or a psychopath. But if they did, that would be really serious.
Well, I mean, I think it would be really funny, but I would probably just laugh at them. But yeah, I guess I brought up this question of like what's wrong with philosophy, and we maybe drifted away from it a little bit because I did want to kind of get into that, right? Like, and I suppose you've said a little bit about this, right? So it seems like from I guess our point of view, I would include myself in this, there are a hell of a lot of philosophers who are endorsing positions that seem to be extremely poorly motivated and maybe even unintelligible, although I'm not sure. But so I mean, was that just what you had in mind there when or was it something more as well that there might be something?
I think it's something broader.
Right.
I mean, I'm doing philosophy in a psychology program, effectively. Yeah. Now, there's a huge psychological element to what I'm doing. I mean, I've conducted studies, I'm analyzing data, but there's also a huge chunk of that is philosophical work. And In coming to suspect that research in psychology that tries to import philosophy into it, what I started to suspect is that the categories that philosophers have constructed and the way that they delineate different sorts of conceptual distinctions are not diagnostic of the way people are naturally disposed to think. These are sort of constructed theories that don't characterize the way ordinary people think. Mm-hmm. That doesn't make the philosophical projects pointless. But it does mean that we need to reconfigure and step back and think about the relationship between the way non-philosophers think and the way philosophers think, and be more mindful of that distinction, because a lot of times philosophers want to sort of seemingly to directly extract out of presumptive folk thinking and discourse some sort of substantive philosophical conclusions. Like if we could figure out how the people use the term knowledge, that this is normative and it will somehow tell us what we know and what we don't know. What if the folk concept is stupid or confused or muddled? Do we just have to conform the way we think to the folk concept? I think not. And so one of the things I think is a more promising avenue is potentially conceptual engineering as a more important and a more substantive future direction for philosophers to take. But there still seems to be this remnant of this conflation between terms and concepts, and this sort of obsession with understanding, with trying to figure out things about how ordinary people think by thinking about how you yourself think, without appreciating that how you yourself think is not necessarily the best way to go about doing that. It's one thing I've said to several people that make a priori arguments about what ordinary people think, is that they're basically just doing bad psychology. They're doing psychology with a sample size of one. Mm-hmm. And so I think philosophers have been insufficiently attentive to the appropriate methods used to assess the kinds of questions that they're asking. And if they were to be more sensitive to that, I think that they would appreciate that there is something for empirical findings to contribute to some of the questions that they're trying to work on. And philosophers seem to be hostile towards that. I haven't seen experimental, I mean, if anything, experimental philosophy seems less popular now than it was 10 or 15 years ago. It seems to have fallen by the wayside and not really received, it doesn't seem to have had the impact on the field that I would have hoped for it to have. Mind you, I'm very critical of experimental philosophy. Almost all my work is criticizing work in experimental philosophy. But that doesn't mean that we should be insensitive to empirical consideration. So I guess, okay, here's the short way to put it. I don't think philosophers fully appreciate and incorporate empirical findings into the way that they approach philosophy.
Yeah, okay. I think I mean, maybe this is a bit of a tangent, but I'm going to say it anyway. My reaction to a lot of the experimental philosophy stuff was, I read it and I felt like, my reaction was, okay, like, who cares about this? But then like finding out folk intuitions about, I don't know, what exactly, how exactly people are thinking about reference, say, or, how people think about, the term knowledge. I read that and it was like, well, that's interesting in itself, but that's not got anything to do with what I care about. But then it made me think, well, wait a minute, what do I care about? Because obviously, if we're talking about intuitions, if we're appealing to intuitions, then we got to do this work. This is exactly what we should be doing to answer questions about what people's intuitions are. So then it made me think that maybe the way that philosophers have gone about things, where, we propose an analysis and then you come up with cases to test your intuitions about those cases, maybe there's something wrong with that. Because this certainly, I feel like experimental philosophy, or at least testing people's intuitions, that can't be the way to answer substantive philosophical problems, can it? I mean, because, as you mentioned, right, maybe people's intuitions are probably just, confused, right? Like, there's no reason why the way that lay people think about knowledge, for example, is going to be interesting or important. That's not how it works in any other field, right? Like, it's not as though scientists are going to care about the way that lay people think about the term energy. Obviously, it would, that wouldn't help them. So I honestly, I don't know. I feel like I've been trained in this sort of tradition of philosophy, and I can see problems with it, but I'm not sure where to go from where I am. So. Can you just carry on?
I think there's this caricature conception of experimental philosophy where the motivation, and to be fair, some of the early X-Fi definitely gave this impression or made the mistake that it's like an epistemic procedure where you poll people and then the majority wins. Like we democratically decide which philosophical positions are true
Right.
based on which position has the majority. And I get incredibly frustrated when I see, this is especially true in older papers, 70% of participants favored compatibilism over incompatibilism, like therefore compatibilism is true, or therefore the folk concept is compatibilism. Neither of those follow. I mean, first of all, that definitely doesn't mean compatibilism is true. It also doesn't even mean the folk concept is compatibilist. What it means is 70% of the people in the survey you conducted gave a seemingly compatibilist response.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a whole bunch of questions about whether are those survey respondents representative of people as a whole? If so, who are they representative of? Are like weird populations, Americans, non-religious people, religious people? So like there's questions of representativeness, and there's all sorts of methodological problems, but I don't really see that as the purpose of experimental philosophy. There is no one purpose to experimental philosophy, but rather what experimental philosophy I think can do is ground or provide some degree of justification for broader metaphilosophical concerns about the nature of intuition and the proper epistemic role that our reflective judgments should play in developing theories. I don't think what it shows is something really sort of bland and kind of dumb, which would be, well, because people have different intuitions, therefore intuitions are unreliable, and therefore we can't use intuitions as a source of evidence. That seems to me to be a weird reaction to it, and I think some X5 proponents may try to make a claim like that. I think it's more complicated than that. But it's hard for me to say what I think it is doing. But one of the things it may be showing is that there are philosophical theory is we're doing it with this like system that's a bunch of hardware and software, and we don't really know how that system works. And it seems very strange to me for people to advocate for and to bring it to metaethics moral perception, like that you could perceive moral facts. Perceive them? Through what sensory faculty? Like, is there like do I have an organ that does it? Is there some system in the brain that does it? Maybe there is, but there has to be some empirical element to that sort of claim. And for someone to just say, no, nothing about that is remotely empirical, that seems very strange to me. That would seem strange. And I think evolutionary debunking arguments are one instance of this relationship between the empirical facts and substantive philosophical questions where, the facts of evolution matter. There's this fantastic paper, I think everybody should read it, that has any interest in this stuff by Mallon and Mashry called Evolution of Morality. Not a helpful title because it's hard to Google, but they point out this ambiguity in evolutionary debunking arguments when people say morality evolved. Well, there's at least three ways of breaking that down, that some of the psychological components of morality evolved, that a capacity for normative cognition evolved, and a capacity for distinctively thinking in moral terms where morality is like a special type of normative cognition, that evolved. And they argue, it might be hard, but there's evidence to support the first two. But the third one, there actually isn't that good of empirical evidence to support like this, that we have like a morality module in the mind. Mm-hmm. And this is where stuff like the lexical hypothesis and the potential for non-weird societies to not seem to have the same normative categories as us, that empirical evidence starts to matter, because that would suggest that like it might not be that evolutionary debunking arguments can be presented in an all or nothing case. Like you debunk morality as a whole or not, because what if moral judgments actually involve a host of different psychological systems, some of which were subject to evolutionary processes that would render them unreliable and some of which weren't. Mm-hmm. Now maybe some moral judgments are justified and some aren't. And this is in fact what Josh Green does in Moral Tribes, where he argues that utilitarian moral judgments do have some degree of justification, but deontological ones don't. He actually appeals to an argument where the empirical details matter, and that should matter to philosophers, and they should take proper stock of that. Sorry, I said a whole lot there. I hope that gets at what I'm trying to get at.
Yes. I think so. And I guess, you know, I mean, to be fair to philosophers, it seems like there are quite a lot of them who are taking on board these sort of empirical facts. So, yeah. Okay. You mentioned, though, that you also had problems with XFI. So, because, you know, you'd said problems with traditional philosophy. I don't know, actually, you might have covered some of your problems with XFI in your in what you said there. But do you want to elaborate on that?
I do. Would we be able to take a quick break?
Oh, yeah, sure, no problem.
Okay, I'm just going to need like 2 or 3 minutes. Give me 1 second.
No problem.
I'll be ready. All right, I'm back. Should I continue?
Yes. So, what's wrong with XFI?
So what I could say is I haven't focused on every area of XFI, obviously. I mean, there's just XFI basically of everything. Mm-hmm. But I could talk a little bit about the two issues that I've focused on most, which is metaethics and free will. The general problem is pretty easy to characterize. So the problem is that philosophers present various vignettes, instructions, scale items. So this would be like little sentences that express a philosophical position. And then you might have a 7-point scale where 1 says strongly disagree, 7 is strongly agree. And then you just give people a bunch of those and say how, you know, express how much you agree or disagree with this statement. And then you aggregate that, and that will give you some sort of index of how much the person endorses moral realism or relativism or belief in free will or whatever it is. So there's all sorts of different paradigms that people use in experimental philosophy. The problem is, I'm not convinced in many of these cases that people are understanding what they're being asked in the way that researchers intend. And that is a absolutely catastrophic problem for these studies, because it means any interpretation in line with the intended research question is wrong. Like results don't mean anything if people don't understand what you're asking them. So this is not a minor issue. If I ask you a question, like I say what time it is, and you think I'm asking you what's your name, and you tell me your name, I don't have any information about what time you think it is. So if a research question in philosophy is presented to people and it's supposed to tell you whether they think free will is compatible with determinism or not, and they don't know what the heck you're talking about, it doesn't matter what their answers on the scale are. They're not addressing the question you're asking. And then if researchers mistakenly think that they're answering the question they think they're asking, then you could get a whole literature of research with results that replicate, with results that you can make predictions with them, with results that correlate with various other sorts of variables. And that is worse than study results that simply don't replicate. Like, you run a study, you run it again, you don't get the same results. That's bad enough, and that's already a very serious problem that many studies are underpowered, or there's just false positives or whatever. I'm not even talking about that issue. I'm saying imagine you have a seemingly good-looking research. That whole research could be complete baloney if the measures are systematically picking up on patterns that have nothing to do or aren't a good reflection of what you're looking at. So, I mean, this is a big enough problem with the metaethics stuff. So some of the earliest studies in metaethics used what I call the disagreement paradigm. And that roughly works like this. You would say something like, you bring your participant in and you say, hey, so Alex thinks murder is wrong. Sam thinks murder is not wrong. Do you think they could both be correct? Or do you think at least one of them must be incorrect? And if they say, oh yeah, I think they could both be correct, that's interpreted as some form of relativism. And if they say, no, I think at least one of them has to be incorrect, that's interpreted as some form of like realism or objectivism. Typically, researchers haven't been consistent with the terminology. But you get the rough idea. And in fact, one of the main papers on this was pretty clear that they're trying to go for this stance dependence versus stance independence. That's not the terminology they used, but that's what they were trying to get at, which is Goodwin and Darley 2008. Now, they actually happened to ask those participants about the disagreement, and I think they used first-person disagreement. So they ask you, like, what do you think abortion is right or wrong? And let's say you say, I think abortion's, it's not wrong. And then they say, okay, well, we did this study before, and previous participants, they all had various sorts of answers. And one of those people, they actually think abortion is wrong. And so given that the two of you disagree, what do you think about that? And then you ask them that question. And then they ask them, why do you think you and that other person disagree with each other? And you could also do this in third personal terms, like Alex and Sam disagree. Why do you think they disagree? when you ask people, why do you think they disagreed with each other? In order for that question to be a valid measure of of the participants' metaethical standards, they would have to think that it's like a fundamental moral disagreement. They actually have to think that the two people have conflicting normative moral standards. They actually think things differently. But when people explain why they think that the other person disagreed, many of them, it's not all of them, but it's a huge chunk, will say stuff like, well, they might have been thinking of a different situation than I was. So if you ask a question about like whether a person shooting into a crowd of people, that was one of the examples that Goodwin and Darley used, like one person thinks it's right, one person thinks it's wrong, they might say, well, maybe, I was thinking of a terrorist shooting people, and they might have been thinking of like a police officer shooting a bunch of criminals. And that's why they disagreed with me. Well, now you're thinking of separate cases. So the fact that you're not actually disagreeing about the same case, so now your answer cannot be diagnostic of your metaethical position. Mm-hmm. You see why that is, right?
Yeah.
And so when we recoded the data, one of my colleagues and I, they had the data, we recoded that data. We found a huge proportion, I can't remember off the top of my head what it was, did not see the disagreement in terms of a substantive moral disagreement. And the majority of the participants either gave answers where it's hard to say, we don't know whether if they thought of it in metaethical terms, or they appeared pretty clearly to probably not think of it in those terms. And when I found that result, that shocked me. I didn't think, anybody is welcome to, it's the original author's data, but I'm sure they would share it with you so you could analyze it yourself. You can look at this data yourself. And I have more open response data where I give people questions and I ask them why you answered this way or what you think this metaethical statement means. This opened the door. I now have, I don't know what it is, something like 20 data sets. I have something like 5,000 written responses to, excuse me, more than a dozen different questions and items related to metaethics. And I've coded those items for, did the person interpret this question or did they explain their answer in a way that indicates that they interpreted it as a question about metaethics? And in the vast majority of cases, the answer is no. In fact, we have some data sets where we have like 100 people or 50 people. And the other person that coded these with me, I might have found one or two, they coded 0 people as interpreting the questions in metaethical terms. So we're not talking like 20% of the people misunderstood the question. We're talking like, in some cases, 50 to 100% of the people did.
Surely, even if they do interpret it in metaethical terms, you still have, you also are going to have the problem that, if so let's just say that I'm a metaethical relativist and I say, abortion is not wrong, and then I meet someone who says abortion is wrong. But even as a relativist, I might say that they are mistaken, right? Because I'm evaluating things from my point of view. And so, or maybe I'm going to assume that they are also a member of my society, and I think that in this society, everybody is governed by the same norms. Like it's cultural relativism rather than individual subjectivism. So I feel like even if you could get everybody to understand that it's a metaethical question, that still wouldn't really track what they're trying to track.
Yeah, you're right about that. And that is one point that Thomas Polzler has raised. He kind of beat me to the punch, which is awesome because he did a good job of pointing out, like, I don't remember the number, but at least half a dozen compounds in my own dissertation, which is this sort of titanic beast. I have a whole chapter just on the disagreement paradigm where I list, all of the problems Polzler has identified and then additional problems. One of them is what you could call the normative confound, which is when participants interpret the question to be asking them about their normative stance, not their metaethical stance. Another problem is this problem of where if you don't specify who the cultural backgrounds of the two people disagreeing, like what their cultural backgrounds are, well, a cultural relativist, as you point out, if we're both members of the same culture and you disagree with me, one of us is mistaken. So actually thinking at least one person's mistaken is consistent with certain forms of relativism, which is not what the authors are going for. So more recent studies, and this is something Polzler has done, actually specify that they have one condition where they specify the person's of the same culture and one where they don't, to control for that confound. Mm-hmm. But that's not the only confound. There are other issues, which is that many people seem to interpret these questions as having an epistemic element to it. So they may interpret it as a question of whether both people have good reasons for their view, or whether it would be they might even interpret it as a question about whether it's morally acceptable for the person to have a contrary view. So people have a wide range of interpretations of these questions that just don't have to do with metaethics. And it's not, there's so many different ways they can misinterpret the questions that I don't see much indication that they almost ever interpret them as intended. Mm-hmm. And, this is the kind of thing you'll get. There's an older paper that was conducted with children, I think between the ages of 4 and 10, which, I'm already skeptical that children would understand these questions. But they were asked this disagreement paradigm, and then when they were asked to explain why. So the child, you ask the child, do you think it's okay to hit other kids on the playground for fun?
Wait,
and they're like, no.
Apologies, somebody's knocking on my door. Yes? Okay. Nothing.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
So let's say you ask the kid, do you think it's okay to hit other kids for fun? They say no. And then you say this other child says it is okay to hit other kids for fun. And they say, do you think you're both right or is one of you wrong? And they say, yeah, one of them's wrong. If you say why, they go, well, they're wrong. And then if you say, well, why are they wrong? Oh, because it's wrong to hit people. Did they interpret it as a metaethical question, or are they just interpreting it as, well, they're wrong because it's wrong to hit people? They're appealing to a normative justification. That is not the justification that a metaethicist would appeal to for why someone else's moral standards are wrong. They would appeal to a metaethical standard.
Well, unless they're engaging in normative entanglement.
Unless they are, but then that wouldn't be a legitimate move. Yeah. But so it's unclear that the question is that the children are just thinking. You ask you ask me, is it okay to hit people? And I'm like, no. Well, if someone else says it's okay to hit people, is it are they right as well? No, they're wrong. Well, why are they wrong? Because it's wrong to hit people. I'm just telling you my normative stance. I as an anti-realist, I could do that. That's why, yeah, they are wrong because it is wrong to hit people.
Yeah.
There's so many problems with these studies that I don't even know how to begin to get into them. But let me give an example. So that's the metaethics stuff. So there are actually, I'll say a few more things about that. So some of the more recent studies, like the Polzer and Wright study, and I've discussed with Polzer about this, is one of the routes they've taken to try to increase the intended interpretation rates is to explain the metaethical concepts to people and then ask them the questions. And they even give people comprehension checks, and they try to make sure that they're able to answer questions about metaethics in a consistent way that's, seems correct. And then they ask them the questions, and then they give answers. Well, okay, so now you can be more confident. I'm still not convinced that they understand the distinctions because they just give multiple choice questions, and they get a couple tries, and I'm not sure that's robust enough. But even when they answer those questions, okay, well, now what are you looking at? If your goal was to get people's pre-theoretical or lay intuitions, are they still pre-theoretical or lay intuitions if you explain the concepts to them and then ask them? Or are you now getting sort of baby philosopher intuitions? Are you getting, and this is what I call my dissertation, there's a potential for what I call spontaneous theorizing. So you could do this with lay people, where I don't think lay people have a view on quantum mechanics. But you could imagine I go to lay people and I say, look, quantum physicists disagree about how to interpret, the fact that you can't know where the location and the speed or whatever of an electron is, however these sorts of considerations are. And they have different interpretations of what's going on with the collapse of the wave function. You just have to give them an explanation of, the Copenhagen and many worlds interpretation. I haven't run this study yet, but I want to. I suspect most people will pick Copenhagen because many worlds, I think, will sound just ridiculous to people. That the universe is just continually branching into different universes. So let's say you ran that study and you explain the distinctions and then they pick one. And you even give them a multiple choice quiz and people pass it. And you only look at the results of people that pass your quantum mechanics quiz. And now you get your result and 80% of people favor Copenhagen. Have you figured out that people's pre-theoretical intuitions are Copenhagen? Maybe you have, but how can you distinguish that from them becoming Copenhagians in the course of your study?
Yeah.
I don't know. How would you distinguish it?
I have no idea.
I mean, you could ask them, does this reflect your pre-theoretical views? Did you come to realize this was your view all along or not? But are you going to trust their introspection on that?
Yeah.
Because I'm not.
Yeah. It's something I've thought about myself when I think about the development of my philosophical views when I first encountered this, because I know, or at least, I know, I am very confident that I was always an anti-realist, at least, I mean, maybe I wasn't when I was like 4, but once I kind of became aware of morality and all that, I think I just always assumed that, like, of course, this is just ultimately, people, adopt whatever values they want. There's not really a fact of the matter. But I mean, was I a non-cognitivist? Did I think that moral claims are neither true nor false? Or was I an error theorist? I mean, I know that when I first encountered metaethics, I thought non-cognitivism was the most plausible. In fact, my initial position was emotivism. But then motivism was the first anti-realist position I encountered. So, I mean, if I'd encountered error theory first, maybe I would have just been an error theorist. I don't know. I don't know how I would figure out, like, what my positions were before then. I don't know. It seems like maybe I just didn't have a position before I encountered the views. So yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, when I think on my phenomenology, I just don't have a clear enough recollection of what I thought. But I have a bizarrely similar profile where I don't recall ever being a realist. I feel like I was always an anti-realist, but I was kind of like a nascent anti-realist. Like it wasn't in my mind, but I feel like if someone had asked, I would have said, yeah, of course that's what I think, and it's what I thought before I walked in this room. But I'm not sure. But I remember actually a really strange and like kind of amusing experience where I was kind of an emotivist or non-cognitivist, and like explicitly, I was in college, I was like, non-cognitivism, yeah. And I remember encountering error theory and mocking it and saying, what a stupid view that all moral claims are false. That's so stupid. And that's ridiculous. And then I was with my friends and we had these weekly meetings to talk philosophy. And I was like, let's look it up so we can make fun of how stupid it is. So I remember looking up, I think it was the Wikipedia page for it, and reading it, like what the claim was. And I'm like, see how, and then I was like, wait, oh, that actually makes sense. And I was like, wait, I think I'm an error theorist now. And it was just really funny because I was so confident it was stupid that I hadn't even read like a formal, concise articulation of it. And then once I did, I was like, oh, wait a minute. Actually, this is, if not correct, it's at least not as silly as I thought that it was.
Why did you think it was stupid when you first encountered it?
I'm trying to remember. I think I thought the combination of both thinking that all the claims are characterized in such a way that they have to be true or false, and then they all happen to be false, just sounded so obviously silly.
Right, yeah.
But I hadn't thought that through at all, because you could just give an example of like witch talk or dragon talk or whatever, and it's very clear that like error theory about unicorns is, a reasonable thing to hold.
Yeah.
I don't think when people talk about unicorns, they're just expressing emotions. That's ridiculous.
Yeah. Yeah, okay. So I'm curious if you have like a paper, just to go back to the X-Fi thing with respect to metaethics, that, I mean, maybe there isn't one that gets everything right, but that you would say is the best.
Like one of my papers or a paper by someone else?
Well, just anybody. So, I mean, you've pointed out all of these problems with the way that people have tried to study folk metaethics. And is there a paper that sort of, you think kind of gets us the furthest past these problems?
There's no one paper that does it. So there's a sort of cluster of papers that I think all have sort of converging insights that have led me towards developing the specific view that I have. Perhaps the most formative was a paper by Michael Gill called, I think the title is Indeterminacy and Variability in Metaethics.
Yeah.
And that paper basically gives this sort of diagnosis of saying, hey, 20th century metaethics, like descriptive metaethics, was this project to try to characterize the folk view. And one hypothesis, and he says this is basically an empirical hypothesis and someone should go look into it. And now they have, maybe he calls it the uniformity determinacy assumption, that ordinary moral discourse and thought is uniform and determinate in its commitments and meaning. And maybe that's just wrong. Maybe it's not. And he's the one that proposed this sort of interpersonal variability as a possibility. So that's one paper. And it just says, here's a possibility, and I'm going to explain the possibility. And here's why we should think that it might be a plausible diagnosis. Another really cool paper, let's see if I can get the name of that one. How to Pull a Metaphysical Rabbit Out of a Semantic Hat. It's got a great title. I forget the rest. I think it has a subtitle. It's by Don Loeb. And in that article, he argues for incoherentism. And it's a specific type of anti-realism. I think he prefers the term irrealism, where he points to the possibility of a certain type of variability where the person is simultaneously committed to contradictory commitments. So like if I say murder is wrong, I'm both committed to it being true in a relativist sense and in the sense that's incompatible with relativism. Like I can't be a realist and an anti-realist simultaneously.
Yeah.
And what he argues is that this could support, to the extent that you take the discourse to fix what our moral terms refer to, if what they refer to is something that is contradictory, like a square circle, then that language is incoherent. And he might be right about that. I think it's possible people have incompatible commitments. So I think that's gesturing towards a sort of alternative way in the categories of anti-realism that are out there, because it's typically going to be, relativism, maybe constructivism, error theory, non-cognitivism, something like that.
Yeah.
Maybe I already said that. But so this points to like an alternative that takes more seriously that there isn't a uniform and determinate folk semantics, that it could just be really messy. So those are two big papers. Another paper, I forget the name of it, is by Neil Sinclair, and I think he has a book that addresses this in more detail. That paper argues against the presumption in favor of realism. I'll have to get the title. We could post it in the comments for people to look up that paper. Yeah. That is a fantastic paper. It has this wonderful quote in the paper that just boom. It's one paragraph. I say too much. He just one paragraph destroys the presumption argument. So those are three major papers.
I want to say you pointed out this thing about incoherentism. You see, I find this kind of position very attractive, but there's two levels on which you can make the incoherentist claim. And so there's, the sort of Loeb's claim is about the metaethical commitments that people have.
Yes.
People are committed to inconsistent metaethical views. But then you can also make the claim, and it's something that I don't know, it's something I find interesting. I think it's worth exploring, that maybe it's just maybe our moral commitments are incoherent on a first order level as well. And I'm not sure what the relation between these two incoherentisms is, but I just wanted to, bring that up because this first order incoherence is something that I've been thinking a bit about, and yeah. So there would be another.
Yeah, I think you have a video on that, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of Richard Joyce, I think, has argued, well, maybe moral claims involve a commitment to free will, and free will is incoherent. I had the thought that maybe moral judgment involves two completely separate types of reasoning. So, there's consequentialist reasoning and then more deontological reasoning. And maybe those types of reasoning are sort of fundamental, ineliminable, and just incompatible. It was interesting because what inspired my thought on this was I happened to be reading a paper by Thomas Nagel where he kind of says this, he says it in a paragraph. It's just a sort of throwaway point, but he makes this point that, morality might just be appealing to these two different systems which we can't make compatible. Now, Nagel, of course, is a realist. I don't think he saw the obvious conclusion from what he said, which is that morality is just inconsistent. Yeah.
Was that your insight on that? I don't recall if that was you were reviewing a paper or.
Oh no! So it's really annoying what happened, or maybe I shouldn't be annoyed, but it is kind of annoying. I happened to be just reading this Thomas Nagel paper, and I thought, oh wait a minute, maybe it's inconsistent on maybe morality is inconsistent because there are two systems, the consequentialist and the deontological. And I actually think there's some empirical evidence on this. That I think you mentioned Joshua Green earlier. And, he's got, I think it's him who's got evidence that there are these distinct, normative systems. Am I right?
Yeah. I can say some more about that because there's bad news for that too.
Oh dear. Well, but okay, I would say there's maybe some reason to take seriously the idea that there could be these different types of reasoning, and maybe the evidence doesn't hold up, but if it does, but yeah, so. I then thought, oh, maybe it's inconsistent, and it's like, oh wow, that's like a new argument. Basically, that is a new argument for anti-realism. And I happened to bring this up when I was having a conversation with somebody else, and then somebody pointed out in the comments that actually, I think it was just like a few months before I expressed this, a guy called Christopher Cowie had written a paper on the first order incoherence of morality, and he appealed to different things. He appealed to population axiology rather than like these broad ways of reasoning. But no, unfortunately, the first order incoherence, I'm not the first. I didn't get there first, but you know, that's the way it goes.
I never seem to get there first. This actually happened with variability and indeterminacy. I was in, I think, my first or second semester. I think it was my first semester at Tufts. And I was just really getting the ball rolling on metaethics. And what had happened is I saw this exchange between Richard Joyce and Stephen Finlay. And it's one of the funniest exchanges of titles I've ever seen. I think it's Finlay started it with a paper called The Error and the Error Theory. And then Joyce responds with the error in the error in the error theory. And I forget which one of them they stopped that chain of inception of errors with like errors upon errors. And then there's a response to that. But in that exchange, I remember they're both just making these claims about what like moral judgments are about. And, you know, Joyce has this, you know, more robust realist commitment that he thinks people have. And Finlay doesn't think that that's the case. He's defending the sort of descriptive account where people are kind of, you know, maybe committed to some type of subjectivism or relativism. And I was thinking, maybe people are committed to both. Maybe it's some people are committed to one and some people are committed to the other. So I wrote this paper and I called it the metaethical diversity hypothesis. And then I came up with what I called between person and within person, or maybe I used interpersonal. I don't even remember anymore. But I had my whole own terminology, metaethical diversity hypothesis. I'm finishing up my term paper on this, and then I come across Gill's paper, the metaethical variability thesis. And I was like, oh my, it's like this, it's almost the same terminology. So it looked like I copied the paper.
Yeah.
It was ridiculous. It was the same paper. And he even had the like between person and within person variability in the paper. There were some small differences, but it's the same thing where someone already had my idea. And it was, on the one hand, it's a bummer that I don't get to be like the first, but on the other, it's good that like I learned that I'm not alone and I'm maybe not an idiot if like a seemingly person that's smarter than me is writing this stuff.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Okay. So just to move on, I think we've covered what we wanted to cover there. So one question I'm curious about is what you sort of think the next step is, right? So if you're successful in kind of converting everybody away from realism, like, do you think that this is going to have, I mean, does this have kind of consequences for, I don't know, like just first order normative discourse? Can we just carry on using moral language in the same kind of way? Or should we carry on using moral language in the same kind of way? And if we do all come to accept anti-realism, is that like the end? You know, do we stop there, or like what do we focus on next?
Yeah, I don't think it's the end. And part of my motivation for pushing anti-realism so hard is because I think that the obsessive focus on abstract theoretical issues that don't have any practical significance is a distraction that prevents us from working on what I think are interesting and substantive questions. I see the dispute about realism and anti-realism as a microcosm of broader methodological problems in philosophy. And one example I'm aware of is, continued conceptual analysis about knowledge and like Gettier problems. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that literature has moved on. It was still somewhat a little bit enforced, but it seemed like the tide of history was moving past that question. I think philosophers just get bored of things. That was back in 2012. I don't know where it's at. I haven't done epistemology or read about it or anything in years. But there's that broader philosophical issue, which is I think people need to stop being insensitive to the empirical stuff, and they need to do this more, I guess I would say roughly Quinean and quietist approach to philosophy. There's various sorts of I have certain methodological approaches to philosophy that I think are probably going to be more productive. So there's that. But then there's a question specifically for metaethics. So let's say we get everybody to be anti-realists. Now what? Well, I still think there's all these practical questions because at the end of the day, if we reject realism, I still don't know what to do. Like, I still want to know what do we do? what do we do? Well, I have stuff I want to do, and you have stuff you want to do, and other people have stuff they want to do. And I do think that there are going to turn out to be facts about the decisions we could collectively make as a group to promote, like, I want to promote my interests. If I could just push a button and make everybody agree with me, I would, but I can't. So at the end of the day, we have to negotiate, and there are better and worse ways of negotiating. There are better or worse ways of reaching compromise. And so what I think that the focus should shift towards is the applied and practical questions related to effective compromise and negotiation. So there's all these sort of applied questions that we can make, how to build a better society, given that we have different conceptions of what a better society is like. And in some cases, this will be, arguing that, hey, here's a good law that maybe it's not ideal for everybody, but, what's that thing? Satisfy everybody. You can't please everybody, but I don't know what the phrase is. But you could create these sort of compromise laws. So there's all these practical questions, and I don't think that those go away. And I think if we clear this issue out of thinking that there's going to be a fact of the matter about it, we could start addressing those questions more effectively. I don't know. What do you think about this?
Well, couldn't the realist just say, all right, why don't you just do that then? I mean, nothing's stopping you from doing that. In fact, couldn't it be the case that we do this sort of research, but just, assuming different metaethical commitments? I mean, presumably somebody could be a realist, but then think that, well, they're interested in how we negotiate with other people and how we build our vision. Because even if you're a realist, people are still going to have different commitments, right? So there's still the practical problem of negotiating those commitments. And I mean, ultimately saying that you're a realist, you can have two people who have different commitments and maybe they don't make any metaethical claim, two people who have different commitments and they both say that they're realists. I mean, ultimately, the realists are just kind of being like, no, but this is really the case. I mean, that doesn't make any practical difference, right? So I wonder if they would say, well, first of all, realism doesn't get in the way of that. And secondly, even if it does, why don't you do it then? Why are you bothering, arguing with realists when you could be doing this?
So, yeah, there's a couple things. I mean, one thing I would say is that I do these other things. So I also have projects related to long-termism and effective altruism. So I am concerned with the psychology of how to get people more disposed towards donating money to more effective charities. Mm-hmm. I'm concerned with the psychology that inhibits people from being concerned about the long-term welfare of human civilization. The fact that we're not investing in stopping asteroids from killing us all, or putting, really thinking hard about how to prevent, something very appropriate now, pandemics, and like bioterrorism or something, that's ridiculous. Like, it's ridiculous that we're so short-sighted about that. Now, it might not be ridiculous if you don't care about the distant future very much, but I think we should care. So I am working on that. So that's one thing to say, is I am doing these other things. The other thing is, I don't just make my decisions about what to do when I wake up in the morning based on what I think is the best way to spend my time from some sort of abstract ideal perspective. Yeah. Because otherwise, I would never play video games, or I wouldn't even be having this conversation. I should be out right now, making money so I could help starving people and help provide medications. That I'm not constituted that way. At the end of the day, here's what I would say. Something about the popularity of moral realism bugs me, and I get some sort of satisfaction out of arguing against it. And that's what I feel like doing. That's just what I want to do.
I want to answer the question you asked earlier directly, because you asked me what I think about the point you made. And the honest truth is that I'm interested in metaethics because I'm interested in questions about, the metaphysics and epistemology of value and all that stuff. And that's just what I like to talk about. Actually, from my point of view, if everybody became an anti-realist, it might make philosophy less interesting for me, because I quite enjoy arguing against realists. And so, if we all agreed with my position, then I'd have to do something else. But I quite like this debate. So, yeah, I mean, obviously, I have normative commitments as well, and I would like the world to be particular ways, but no, I enjoy engaging in debates about those sort of metaphysical and epistemological questions. So I'm not so bothered by the prevalence of realists.
Yeah, maybe I shouldn't be bothered, because when you said that, I was like, wait, how would I react if everyone was an anti-realist? I would lose like my main hobby. What would I do? Like it just might be unfathomably boring.
Yeah.
That might be the worst possible situation for me. Ugh, that's a nightmare. Now, should I stop? Like, what if I succeed? I've rendered my own life goals irrelevant.
Well, I unfortunately, I mean, I don't think one person can have that kind of influence. I'm not expecting that there's going to be too many realists who will be moved by anything you say.
Yeah, that's
maybe
true.
some though. Okay, well, just in case this is a danger, though, just in case everything we've said so far has been so powerfully convincing that there are no realists left, I was curious, because I just always like asking this question, like, what you think the best argument for realism is. I mean, and maybe we should separate that into best argument for naturalist realism, best argument for non-naturalist realism. You know, I guess if you had to make a case for the alternative position.
It's a real tough question. I'm tempted to just say it's hard. They're all like, if I was scoring them, they all get a 1 out of 10. So it's hard to say that any of them are better than the others. And I also just, I don't like, I get real frustrated with people that are really obsessed with presenting arguments in philosophy as like the premise, like PPC style. That is not typically how people think or write. And I think it's really artificial to present arguments in that way. And so I wouldn't be able to give you one of those. Like, you know, the moral argument, like from God or some whatever.
No, I wasn't asking for that. I mean, just
sure.
Well, I answer it however you wish.
I got you.
You know, I've also found myself. I realized this like just recently, the other day. I was thinking about this. Sorry, this is kind of a tangent, but you know reminded me that I think in my entire PhD, I don't think I actually like outlined an argument in a premise 1, premise 2. I don't think I did that. And I mean, I didn't do it because I didn't need to, but then I was thinking, that is quite an artificial way of presenting arguments. And maybe it's kind of important to learn how to do that when you're first doing philosophy, but then you maybe get to a point where, yeah, I don't know what I'm saying, but I think I agree. Yeah.
Right. So I think for non-naturalist realism, I don't think that there's much. So like, I don't find the argument from convergence very convincing at all. I mean, one thing I say to, I immediately say to that is people have been converging on wearing jeans and eating McDonald's. I don't think that's evidence of aesthetic and gastronomic and like fashion realism. And I mean, that's just a glib way of saying that there are, like, if we're appealing to abductive inference, there are better explanations for convergence and moral standards than people all recognizing the moral facts collectively or something. So, most of those arguments I just don't find very convincing. But I think the best case that realists could make would have to appeal to something like that the anti-realists are missing something conceptually. So if they could make a compelling case that we're not getting it, they can make the same, because from their point of view, we might be very similar to someone that's like denying that like 2 + 2 = 4 or something.
Yeah.
They might just be like, well, then you just or that there are prime numbers. They might just say that you just don't understand what a prime number is. And it's possible for someone to not understand what a prime number is. They just don't get it. And like, that doesn't make whatever position you want to take on mathematics false because someone doesn't get mathematics. And I think that they could just say, look, we have conceptual access to certain sorts of considerations that, from whence it follows that moral realism is true. And if you don't get it, that's your problem. And I think that would be the probably the strongest case non-naturalists could make. Some sort of conceptual deficiency argument against anti-realists.
I mean, I mentioned earlier that this is something that bothers me, that I worry that maybe I'm just missing something, because there are so many people who take this seriously, and not just take it seriously, but who have thought it through. I mean, like, so when you know, I don't know. Maybe I am just missing something. And I mean, also, you know, if I think about my own psychology, maybe they've got a good point. Like, at least in my case, you know, I think that I'm not like I don't know. I never know how to say this without coming across as like an edgelord. But the thing is, it's just true. I don't have like a very high compassion sort of drive. In fact, I used to be like a sort of right-wing libertarian, like a libertarian in the US sense. I'm not anymore, but that's not because my sort of fundamental values have changed. It's just because, you know, I have philosophical problems with it. But I don't know. I remember reading, I think it's Jonathan Haidt, did that stuff on like the moral assumptions of different political views. And in the case of libertarians, it's like they're super high on concerns about liberty, but they don't seem to have any concern for like harm and fairness and stuff like that. And the thing is that regardless of whether or not that's true for libertarians in general, the point is I looked at that and I was like, yeah, that pretty much tracks for me, right? That basically does describe my psychology. And so, you know, when I think about my own case, I'm like, yeah, maybe realists have got a reasonable point that I just maybe am psychologically constituted so that I'm not getting something that's important. Having said that, I also know plenty of anti-realists who have completely different psychological constitutions to me, so I'm not really sure that I need to be too worried by this point. Plenty of anti-realists who, you know, are very compassionate and have great deals of, you know, empathetic concern for others and so on. So, yeah.
Yeah, that can, there might be a sort of asymmetry where most moral realists tend to have more compassion. I'm not sure that that's actually true, but it could be that people that have some sort of normative or compassion or emotional deficiencies are more inclined towards anti-realism, and that could give the impression that anti-realism is somehow like causing that rather than it being a sort of attractor for people that are like that. Because yeah, most people, I think I might also fall low in compassion, but like you could sort of distinguish between a kind of cold compassion, which is like, I care about the numbers, you know? I mean, this is why I'm a big fan of effective altruism. If I could, you know, push a button and save millions of lives somewhere, I really feel like I would do that. I should do that. Like I got to do it. I got to push that button and save millions of lives. But that sort of local compassion is like that sort of feeling of warmth and fuzziness that people have for one another. Like, you know, fellow feeling. Don't really have a very strong sense of that. So maybe there's something off with me or with you, or I don't know. But if that's the case, it's interesting to me that realists show almost no interest in actually doing the labor of showing that. Like, I don't see them doing the research to show, like, plug us in an MRI and see what our brains look like. You know, point to differences in your brain and my brain that show you've got, you know, some sort of, you've got the moral lobe and I don't.
Yeah.
They don't do this. They don't seem to be interested in doing it. Why? If they think that that's true, show it, prove it. Because if they could actually point, you know, we could, and this is one thing they'll say, moral realists will say, well, maybe you just have a kind of blindness, the way some people are colorblind, maybe you're sort of morality blind.
Yeah.
Maybe. But, you know, if you want to draw on that analogy, we can actually give a physiological account of why some people are colorblind or not. And we can't do that with anti-realists. At least not yet. No. And if they could, maybe I'd be on board with them. But they haven't. So yeah, I feel pretty similarly about that.
That would be fascinating, wouldn't it? If somebody, like, I mean, I'm not sure exactly what this evidence would look like, but I'm just thinking, like, if they did find, you know, a moral lobe, I'm not sure how that would change my evaluation of the debate. I mean, I don't think it would be a victory for realism. There would still be, I think, a whole load of things to overcome, but like, yeah, it would be really interesting to have to deal with that problem. As an anti-realist.
That reminds me, and if you don't mind, I wanted to bring up a question there, which is that, you know, one of the questions for me as an anti-realist is that I think there's various sorts of explanatory responsibilities I have as an anti-realist. And one of them is, if anti-realism is the correct position and realism is incorrect, I still think I owe an explanation of why there are moral realists and why it seems so compelling to people. And then most importantly, why it seems so compelling to very intelligent people, many of them smarter than me, that have thought about this for much longer than me and with much more rigor and care. I mean, I have no doubt that Derek Parfit read much more about metaethics than I have, and was very, very committed to realism. So, you know, what's going on there. And I do think that there are potentially really interesting psychological differences between people that explicitly identify with realism and anti-realism. One possibility is that there is an underlying shared psychology between people that are inclined towards moral realism and people that are more inclined towards sort of meaning making and pattern making in general. You could call it a type of, and this is something one of my colleagues, I don't know if they want me to say their name or not. I could put it in the comments if they see this and they're like, yeah, I want attribution. They compared it, I don't know how to pronounce it, pareidolia, like people that see faces in clouds and faces on toast. There is research showing that religious people are more inclined to see this sort of imagery. I don't know if there's research showing the sort of that people more inclined to see this imagery are more likely to become religious if they were raised secular or anything like that, to show this sort of causal connection between the two of them rather than just there being some correlation. But it's possible that there's something like a type of meaning pareidolia going on with moral realists, where they like the way that some people see faces and agents out in the world. They think there's invisible agents and there's people out there. They are inclined to feel like there's meaning or value out in the world, like it's external to them. It psychologically has that phenomenology because of a psychological difference between them and you and I, where we don't have that phenomenology. And like maybe you could actually point to a psychological feature of their brain that's different than ours. But just like, I don't think that because some people are inclined to see Jesus in toast and I'm not, that means that Jesus is appearing in the toast. I'm also not necessarily inclined to think that because some people project meaning onto the world, that there is in fact meaning in the world. It could be that they evolved some sort of, meaning-making hallucination. I don't know.
Yeah. Okay. I think that was everything that I wanted.
We didn't
to talk
address
about.
Naturalism.
Oh,
if you wanted to.
Okay, yeah. Let's go with that.
Unfortunately, I came up short on that one. I couldn't come up with what I thought was a good argument for it, because I think it just fundamentally misses the mark so much. I do think that there are some interesting theories out there that try to account for all morality. Like I wouldn't find very compelling an account that is going to give me this sort of seemingly ad hoc list of moral concerns. So if someone said, I'm a naturalist and moral facts are like facts about like Haidt's moral foundations, and there's not any sort of principled conceptual unity between them. Like there's just some of the facts are about purity, some of the facts are about fairness, some of the facts are about liberty. Okay, but why are those all about morality then? Why not just say there are facts about liberty and facts, like what makes them all moral facts? That I wouldn't find very compelling. Accounts that at least attempt to collapse it all into one sort of underlying, I guess you could call it like value or something, I find at least prima facie more interesting as possibility. So like one of them would be, I think it's a paper by Kim Strelny and Dan Fraser. They try to argue that there's a type of naturalist account where we could say that moral facts are fundamentally facts about cooperation. I don't find that very compelling, but I at least think that if you're going to offer a naturalist account, that's on the right track. I don't find these accounts compelling because there's this paper by Synod Armstrong and Wheatley, I think it's called The Disunity of Morality and Why It Matters to Philosophy, where they sort of go through all the ways one might try to offer a principled account of moral judgments as a natural kind, and they argue that all of those accounts fail. And so that's one of my major concerns with naturalism, is that setting aside the issues of whether it's even a legitimate type of realism, I just don't think that they get the empirical facts right. Like the empirical facts of what morality is about are all over the place. Like morality, for some people, it's about acting on self-interest. For some people, it's about altruism. For some people, it's about this grab bag. I think for some people, it might be, for you, more fundamentally about unity. For other people, it's clearly about equality or fairness. And then for others, it's about suffering. And those people, that's not negotiable to them. Morality is about those things. And if you said, no, that's not what morality is about, they wouldn't say, oh, morality isn't what I thought it's about. They would say, you've changed the subject.
Yeah.
Like this. So, and I don't think there's a way around that. So I don't think naturalists are going to be able to give a unified account. But if they did, I think maybe cooperation is the most plausible one they could point to.
Yeah. Yeah, okay. I think that's everything then. So thanks very much for that conversation. That was really interesting, and I hope the viewers enjoyed. And that's everything for today. So I don't know if you had anything you wanted to end with.
I think I've said a lot.
Right.
One of the things I'd love to talk about is the free will stuff at some point, but I don't want to rehash a topic that I think we already explored pretty thoroughly.
Okay.
Like
Well, I mean,
with respect to metaethics.
yeah, hey, if you ever want to, I don't know, talk about free will, you're welcome to come on the channel again, and we can do that. So yeah, cool. All right, I'm gonna stop
Cool.
the
Okay.
recording
Guess we'll leave
now.
it there.
So goodbye, everybody.